The first spoonful was given with love, not suspicion. In Victorian England, when a child would not sleep, when coughing shook a small chest raw, doctors reached for a bottle that promised calm, and inside it was heroin, blended into syrup and labeled as medicine for children. Parents trusted the science. Physicians spoke with confidence, coats crisp, voices steady beneath gaslight and oak-paneled ceilings. This was an age that believed deeply in progress, in chemistry, in the authority of men who wrote prescriptions by hand and assured mothers that relief was finally within reach. A measured dose, a quiet night, a still crib. No one spoke of addiction. No one imagined consequences stretching years into the future. If you're listening late or watching from somewhere quiet, take a moment to subscribe and stay with me and tell me where you're joining from tonight. These stories surface best in stillness, when history can speak without interruption, because beneath the soft sweetness of those syrups was a darker truth, an entire generation learning dependence before it could speak. Tonight, we uncover how Victorian medicine crossed a line it did not yet know existed, and how children became the silent patients of an age drunk on its own certainty. It sits where the family can see it, placed deliberately, not hidden. A small glass bottle, thick-walled and weighty in the hand, its label printed in careful serif-ed letters that speak of science, relief, and modern care. It rests on the mantel beside the clock, near the framed photograph of a child posed stiffly in Sunday clothes, cheeks pale, eyes already familiar with stillness. Nothing about the bottle appears dangerous. It is medicine, after all. It has been prescribed. The room smells faintly of coal smoke and boiled milk. Gaslight hums overhead, softening edges, forgiving imperfections. Outside, the street carries the low murmur of carriage wheels and distant footsteps. But inside the house, everything is arranged for calm. The child has been crying again. Not loudly, not rebelliously, just enough to disturb the rhythm of the evening. Enough to worry a mother who has been told that good children sleep and that proper households are quiet. The doctor's visit is still fresh in the mind. His arrival was unhurried, his manner reassuring. He spoke of nerves, of delicate constitutions, of how modern medicine had advanced beyond the crude remedies of the past. He explained that pain exhausted the young, that coughing strained the lungs, that rest was not merely comfort but necessity. He did not raise his voice. He did not hesitate. He wrote the prescription neatly, as though certainty itself flowed through the pen. Heroin syrup, he called it, though the word carried none of the weight it would one day bear. It was described as refined, purified, improved, safer than opium, gentler than laudanum. A scientific step forward, a triumph of chemistry. He spoke as if danger belonged to the past, to ignorance, to less disciplined eras. This, he implied, was medicine that could be trusted. Now the bottle waits. Its cork is snug, its contents dark and glossy, catching the lamplight when lifted. The syrup smells faintly sweet, medicinal but not unpleasant. It is designed that way. Sweetness signals safety. Sweetness invites compliance. Sweetness ensures the spoon will not be resisted. The child watches from the small chair by the fire, eyes heavy, body restless. Thin fingers twist the edge of a blanket worn smooth by years of use. There is no fear, yet only fatigue, only the vague discomfort of a body that does not know why it aches. Childhood illness has been reframed as malfunction, something to be corrected swiftly, efficiently, without fuss. The spoon is measured carefully, a few drops only. The instructions were clear. Precision matters. Precision makes this science. The mother's hand trembles slightly, not from doubt but from responsibility. She has been entrusted with this. To follow directions is to be good. To question would be improper. Doctors know things that mothers are not meant to. The syrup touches the tongue, slides down easily. There is no bitterness, no struggle. The child swallows, blinks, and within minutes the crying softens, then stops altogether. Breathing slows. Muscles loosen. The small body slumps into sleep with an ease that feels like relief to everyone watching. The room exhales. This is what healing looks like, they believe. No one speaks of what has been quieted beyond the cough. No one wonders what else has been slowed, dulled, or silenced within that small body. The calm is immediate, undeniable. In a world that values order, obedience, and visible results, this feels like success. The bottle is returned to its place on the mantel, now associated with peace. It becomes part of the household's rhythm, a solution waiting patiently for the next disturbance. Its presence reassures. It promises control over the unpredictable chemical mastery over childhood itself. Outside, the city continues, factories humming, laboratories experimenting, journals publishing triumph after triumph of modern medicine. Progress is everywhere, and it smells faintly of sweetness and certainty. No one yet understands that the bottle does more than soothe. No one yet knows what it is teaching the child's body to expect. Sleep was treated as evidence. In a proper household, a sleeping child proved that everything beneath the roof was in order, that routines were followed, morals intact, health maintained. Restlessness, by contrast, suggested a failure somewhere. Either the body was faulty, or the care surrounding it was insufficient. In Victorian England, wakefulness was not merely inconvenience. It was suspicion. The child lies in bed beneath heavy blankets, the room carefully arranged to encourage stillness. Curtains are drawn to keep out drafts and noise. The air is close, faintly medicinal, tinged with coal smoke drifting in through the walls. The bed is firm, the sheets clean, the pillow placed just so. Everything has been done correctly, and yet the child does not sleep. Eyes open and close without commitment. Small limbs twitch, then still, then twitch again. The body seems unable to settle, as though it has forgotten how. A soft whimper rises, not loud enough to be called crying, but persistent enough to mark time. Each sound travels down the hallway, through closed doors, reminding the household that something is unresolved. This is how the problem is framed, not as suffering, but as interruption. The mother counts the hours. She remembers the doctor's words about nerves, how children, especially sensitive ones, were prone to agitation. He had spoken of the modern age, of industrial noise, of overstimulation, though the child has barely ventured beyond the street. He suggested that sleep must sometimes be encouraged, guided, assisted by chemistry. Rest, he said, was the foundation of growth. The child does not understand this language. The body simply feels wrong, too warm, too tight, too aware. Teeth press painfully beneath the gums. The chest tightens with shallow coughs. Thoughts flutter without form. There is no vocabulary for discomfort yet, only sensation. In earlier generations, such wakefulness might have been endured. Rocking, pacing, long nights spent murmuring reassurances in the dark. But patience has become unfashionable. Endurance is inefficient. Modern life moves quickly, even for children. Medicine offers a shortcut. The doctor had described sleeplessness as strain. Strain led to weakness. Weakness led to illness. It was all very logical, arranged in clean lines of cause and effect. The child, by remaining awake, was not merely tired, he was at risk. That was the language used. Risk demands intervention. So the spoon is lifted again. The syrup slides down, sweet and unquestioned. Within minutes, the body responds. The restlessness dissolves as if it were never real. Limbs grow heavy, breathing deepens. The whimper vanishes, replaced by the soft rhythm of sleep. The transformation is immediate, dramatic, convincing. This, the household learns, is what works. Night after night, the pattern repeats. Whenever sleep hesitates, the bottle appears. The child begins to associate rest not with comfort or safety, but with the taste of syrup. The body learns its lesson quickly. Chemistry becomes the signal that rest may begin. No one marks this as learning. It is called relief. Teachers later remark on how calm the child is, how well behaved, how unlike others who fidget and chatter. The stillness is praised. Calm is mistaken for character. The absence of complaint is mistaken for health. But something else is happening quietly, invisibly, beneath the skin. The child's body begins to wait. Discomfort no longer resolves on its own. When the medicine fades, unease returns sharper, more insistent. The solution is obvious. Another spoon, another dose, another night of success. Sleep, once a natural rhythm, has been outsourced. No one notices that the child no longer drifts into rest without assistance. No one asks why waking feels worse than before. These questions do not yet exist. The medical language has not caught up to the reality unfolding in small bedrooms across the city. The child who would not sleep is no longer a problem. The child who now cannot sleep without medicine has not yet been named. They did not arrive with urgency. Victorian doctors prided themselves on calm, on the measured cadence of their voices, on the reassuring stillness of their hands. A raised tone suggested uncertainty. Hesitation implied ignorance. Authority, by contrast, was quiet. The doctor removes his gloves slowly, sets his bag down with care, and surveys the room as though already familiar with its contents. He does not rush to the child. He does not kneel or coo. He observes from a polite distance, eyes moving from pale face to thin wrists to the bottle already standing on the mantel. He nods almost imperceptibly. Everything appears as expected. He speaks of constitutions, of how some children are born finer, more delicate, more sensitive to the pressures of modern life. He references nerves not as weakness, but as refinement. Sensitive children, he explains, feel the world more deeply. Their systems respond too readily, their sleep disrupted by even minor discomforts. This is not failure, it is temperament. The words are chosen carefully. Nothing he says invites alarm, nothing suggests danger. His language wraps itself around concern and transforms it into reassurance. He does not warn, he does not speculate. He states. The parents listen closely. They have already been taught that medical language is not meant to be interrupted. Questions are not discouraged outright, but they are subtly rendered unnecessary. The doctor explains before doubt can form. His confidence fills the room, leaving no space for unease. He speaks of progress, of how medicine has advanced beyond crude plant tinctures and unreliable folk remedies. Chemistry, he explains, has refined what nature made blunt. Heroin, he says the word plainly, without emphasis, without pause, is cleaner than opium, more predictable, easier to control. It does not carry the same risks. It is modern. He does not mention time. He does not mention duration. He does not discuss what happens when the medicine is no longer present. Such questions have not yet become respectable. Instead, he offers instructions. A few drops, only when necessary. Precision, again, is emphasized. Precision reassures. It implies mastery. A controlled substance suggests controlled outcomes. He observes the child briefly, placing 2 fingers at the wrist, counting silently. The pulse is steady now, the breathing even. He smiles not broadly, not sentimentally, but with professional satisfaction. This is the smile of a man whose expectations have been met. You see, he says gently, how well it suits him. The words land like proof. The parents nod. Gratitude replaces anxiety. The problem has been named, addressed, managed. The house feels orderly again. The future, briefly, feels manageable. The doctor packs his bag. He does not linger. Lingering implies uncertainty. His visit is complete. He leaves behind not only a prescription, but permission, the permission to rely, to administer, to trust. Once gone, his authority remains. It echoes in the careful measuring of doses, in the unquestioned repetition of treatment, in the quiet reassurance that follows each successful night. The doctor does not need to return. His presence has already been absorbed into the household's routine. What no one notices is how rarely he returns to see the child again. Follow-up is unnecessary when symptoms appear resolved. Silence is interpreted as success. Absence of complaint becomes confirmation. In medical journals, cases are written up in similar tones. Children calmed, coughs suppressed, sleep restored, outcomes reported without complication. The language remains optimistic, restrained, confident. Negative results are not yet recognized as such. The absence of immediate catastrophe is taken as validation. Doctors continue to speak softly, and because they do, no one thinks to raise their voice. The ailments were small. That was the reassurance offered again and again, that childhood complaints were minor, manageable, unworthy of alarm. A cough, after all, was expected in a city thick with smoke. Teething was inevitable. Tears came and went. None of these things were meant to trouble the household for long. And yet, taken together, they formed a steady presence. A child who coughed through the night. A child whose gums burned and throbbed without relief. A child who cried not from fear, but from a dull, persistent discomfort that never quite left. Victorian medicine did not see these as passages to be endured. It saw them as inefficiencies. The cough was the most persuasive. It rattled the chest, echoed through narrow hallways, interrupted meals and sleep alike. Doctors spoke of bronchial irritation, of delicate lungs struggling against urban air. They warned that prolonged coughing weakened the constitution, inviting greater illness. A remedy that could still the lungs was not indulgence, it was prevention. Teething, too, was recast as medical urgency. Swollen gums were blamed for fevers, convulsions, even death. A restless child was seen not as developing, but as endangered. The body, it was believed, needed assistance to survive its own growth. And tears were treated as evidence that something inside the child was wrong, overstimulated, inflamed, misfiring. A crying child suggested failure somewhere in the system of care. No respectable household wished to appear negligent. The syrup answered all of it. A spoon for the cough, and the chest eased. A spoon for the gums, and the pain retreated. A spoon for the tears, and the child fell quiet. The solution was elegantly simple, too simple to doubt. Medicine had always been bitter. That bitterness had once served as warning, a reminder that what healed might also harm. Heroin syrup erased that signal entirely. Sweetness replaced caution. The child accepted the dose willingly. There was no struggle, no resistance, no sense that something unnatural had been introduced. The child learned quickly what the adults had already decided. Discomfort ended when the spoon appeared. What had once been separate sensations, pain, irritation, distress, were folded together into a single experience with a single answer. The body no longer needed to differentiate. It only needed to wait. Doctors praised the efficiency. Mothers praised the peace. Fathers praised the return of order to the home. No one praised endurance. No one praised adaptation. These were not modern virtues. Over time, the ailments seemed to return more frequently. The cough lingered longer than expected. The child fussed sooner at the first hint of discomfort. The threshold for distress lowered, subtly, invisibly. But this was not interpreted as consequence. It was interpreted as confirmation that the medicine was necessary. When the syrup was withheld, even briefly, the child grew unsettled in unfamiliar ways. Sleep fractured. Whimpering returned sharper, edged with agitation rather than pain. The cough seemed worse, the tears more urgent. This too reinforced belief. Clearly, the condition had returned. Clearly, the remedy was still required. No one yet had the language to describe withdrawal. No one thought to apply it to a child. Medical texts of the time framed childhood as fragile, perpetually at risk. Any tool that promised control over that fragility was embraced. Heroin syrup did not simply treat symptoms, it provided certainty in an uncertain world. It made suffering predictable, manageable, quiet. What went unrecorded were the moments between doses, the subtle dulling of curiosity, the way the child's play slowed, movements less spontaneous, laughter rarer but softer. These changes were not alarming, they were convenient. A quiet child was a healthy child. A compliant child was a successful outcome. Thus, coughs, teeth, and tears were folded neatly into medicine bottles across the city. The ordinary discomforts of growing up were no longer rites of passage, they were conditions to be suppressed. And in suppressing them, Victorian medicine taught a generation of small bodies a lesson it did not yet understand it was giving. That relief came not from time, or comfort, or resilience, but from the spoon. The taste was intentional. Victorian pharmacists understood instinctively what physicians rarely discussed aloud: bitterness discouraged compliance, while sweetness invited trust. Sugar did not merely mask medicine, it softened the very idea of it. A sweet remedy felt benevolent. It felt chosen for comfort rather than control. Heroin syrup was crafted accordingly. Thick, dark, and glossy, it clung to the spoon with a reassuring weight. Its sweetness lingered on the tongue long after the dose was swallowed, leaving no trace of alarm behind. To a child, it did not feel like treatment. It felt like kindness. This mattered more than anyone realized. In earlier decades, medicine had been something endured. Children had been held down, coaxed, bribed, or scolded through bitter draughts and sharp smells. Illness had been unmistakably unpleasant. The boundary between sickness and health was drawn in taste alone. Heroin syrup erased that boundary entirely. Now the act of dosing became gentle. No struggle, no tears, no raised voices. The child opened their mouth willingly, even expectantly. The spoon became a familiar visitor, arriving not with dread but with relief. Sweetness reframed the entire ritual. Parents noticed this and felt reassured by it. A medicine that a child accepted without protest seemed inherently safer. Resistance, after all, had always been associated with danger. If the body rejected something, surely it was not meant to be there. Acceptance suggested compatibility, harmony. Doctors did not correct this assumption. It suited the narrative of progress too well. Sweetness also dissolved suspicion. In a society that increasingly distrusted anything harsh or crude, refined flavors signaled refinement of purpose. This was not poison. This was chemistry perfected. Modern medicine no longer needed to taste like punishment. The child learned this lesson quickly, long before language could form around it. Discomfort led to sweetness. Pain was followed by pleasure. Relief arrived not merely as absence of suffering, but as a positive sensation in its own right. The body began to anticipate the taste as much as the calm that followed. This anticipation was subtle at first. A slight stillness when the bottle was lifted, a softening of posture, a readiness that went unnoticed because it appeared cooperative. Good behavior, adults called it. What sweetness truly did was blur cause and effect. The child did not experience pain and then relief. They experienced pain and then sweetness. The two became inseparable. Relief was no longer neutral. It was rewarding. In medical texts, this aspect was never discussed. Taste was considered secondary, a mere vehicle for delivery. Yet, it was taste that made repetition effortless. Taste that removed friction. Taste that ensured the medicine would be used again and again without resistance. Over time, the child began to recognize the bottle even before symptoms fully formed. A cough did not need to worsen. Restlessness did not need to escalate. The expectation of relief alone became enough to trigger unease. The body, having learned the pattern, moved ahead of discomfort to secure its solution. This, too, went unnoticed. Sweetness created the illusion of care without cost. Parents did not feel as though they were administering something powerful. They felt as though they were offering comfort. The act became almost maternal, folded seamlessly into bedtime routines and quiet evenings. No warning accompanied the taste, no sharpness lingered to provoke doubt. Sweetness anesthetized concern as effectively as it did pain. The bottle returned to the mantel again and again, its presence unchallenged. It blended into the domestic landscape like jam jars and tea tins, indistinguishable from nourishment. Medicine ceased to feel like intervention. It felt like maintenance. And in that transformation from bitter necessity to sweet assurance, something essential was lost. The child was never given the chance to distinguish between relief and reward, between healing and pleasure. The body was never asked to endure. It was trained to expect. Sweetness taught the lesson quietly, efficiently, without resistance. And once learned, it did not easily fade. The instruction was always the same, only a few drops. Precision was emphasized as proof of safety, as though danger could be calibrated out of existence by careful measurement. Victorian medicine placed enormous faith in quantities. Too much was reckless, too little ineffective, but the correct amount promised control. The spoon, the dropper, the marked line on the glass became symbols of restraint. Parents followed these instructions faithfully. They counted. They tilted the bottle just enough. They wiped the lip before returning the cork. The ritual mattered. It transformed the act from indulgence into responsibility. This was not excess. This was discipline. The doctor's handwriting lingered in the air whenever the bottle was opened. Even in his absence, his authority guided the hand. To deviate from the prescribed amount would have been improper, even dangerous. The drops were not merely liquid, they were instructions obeyed, trust enacted. Trust was the true substance being administered. Victorian households were structured around hierarchy. Knowledge flowed downward, never upward. Doctors were trained men, educated in institutions that promised mastery over the body's mysteries. Mothers were expected to nurture, not analyze. Fathers were expected to provide, not question. The medicine bridged these roles neatly. It allowed care without challenge. Each measured dose reinforced belief in the system that produced it. The child slept. The cough softened. The tears ceased. Outcomes appeared immediate and repeatable. There was no visible penalty for repetition, no sudden catastrophe to provoke doubt. In such an environment, caution felt unnecessary, even rude. The drops were given not because the household was careless, but because it was conscientious. Yet measurement created an illusion. It suggested that harm only emerged when rules were broken, not when they were followed. As long as the dose remained within limits, danger was presumed absent. The idea that harm could accumulate quietly, invisibly, was not yet part of medical thinking. Heroin syrup did not announce itself as something that altered the body fundamentally. It behaved too politely for that. Its effects were smooth, predictable, and short-lived, at least on the surface. The child calmed. Sleep arrived. The room settled. What happened afterward beneath the calm remained unseen. Over time, the drops became easier to justify. What had once been reserved for difficult nights began to appear at the first hint of restlessness. Why wait for distress when prevention was possible? The doctor had spoken of strain, of how suffering weakened children. Better to intervene early, better to protect. Thus the line between treatment and routine blurred. The child did not protest. There was no reason to. The body accepted the drops readily, almost gratefully. The familiarity of the ritual replaced fear with expectation. The medicine arrived before discomfort fully formed, and in doing so, taught the body that discomfort should not be tolerated at all. No one recorded this shift. It happened gradually, without drama. Medical journals continued to praise measured dosing as evidence of responsibility. Excess was condemned, but repetition was not. The idea that correct use could still lead to unintended consequences was considered pessimistic, even unscientific. Medicine, after all, was improving. Progress implied refinement, not new forms of harm. The bottle remained on the mantel, its level slowly lowering. Each drop removed was replaced by confidence rather than concern. Refills were requested without hesitation. Pharmacists supplied them without question. The system functioned smoothly. Measured drops became measured trust. Trust in doctors. Trust in science. Trust in the belief that control, once achieved, would remain harmless. No one yet understood that the body was learning something the measurements could not track, that it was adapting not to illness, but to relief itself. The instruction was never spoken aloud, yet it was understood everywhere. A good mother followed advice. Victorian motherhood was framed as duty refined by obedience. Care was expected to be tireless, but never improvisational. Authority did not rest in the hands that rocked the cradle or wiped fevered brows. It rested elsewhere, in institutions, in men with training, in voices that spoke calmly and carried credentials. To question those voices was not framed as curiosity, it was framed as impropriety. A mother might notice things. She might observe how her child's eyes dulled after the syrup, how laughter softened into something quieter, how wakefulness returned sharper than before when the bottle was withheld. But observation was not the same as interpretation. Interpretation belonged to medicine. She had been taught this carefully. Medical pamphlets, household guides, and women's journals all reinforced the same lesson. Mothers were caretakers, not thinkers. Their role was to administer, not analyze. Anxiety was treated as weakness, doubt as ignorance, trust above all was praised as virtue. So, when the doctor spoke, she listened. When the prescription was written, she complied. When the syrup worked, she felt relief rather than suspicion. Even when uncertainty flickered briefly, privately it was smoothed over by social expectation. Other mothers used the same remedies. Pharmacies stocked the same bottles. Journals spoke of the same successes. To doubt was to place oneself outside the circle of respectable care. There was also fear, not of the medicine, but of being seen as negligent. A child who cried too long, coughed too often, or failed to sleep reflected poorly on the household. Intervention was proof of diligence. Doing nothing looked like indifference. Thus, obedience became a form of protection. Mothers learned to measure drops precisely, to maintain schedules, to observe improvement as instructed. They learned not to ask how long treatment should continue, not to wonder what happened after symptoms vanished. Such questions were unnecessary. If the doctor had thought them important, he would have mentioned them. The syrup fit neatly into this structure. It required no judgment, only repetition. It offered visible results without confrontation. It allowed a mother to feel effective while remaining compliant. In a society that scrutinized women relentlessly, this mattered. There were no meetings where these lessons were taught, no lectures on silence. They were absorbed gradually, through tone and posture, through raised eyebrows and approving nods. A questioning woman was gently corrected, a trusting one was praised. And so the bottle stayed. When doubts arose, they were reframed. Perhaps the child was naturally sensitive. Perhaps illness ran in the family. Perhaps this was simply the way some children were. Medical language offered explanations that absolved the medicine of responsibility. The mother watched her child grow quieter, calmer, easier to manage. Others commented approvingly. Such a well-behaved child, such a peaceful household. These remarks carried weight. They silenced lingering unease more effectively than reassurance ever could. If the child struggled without the syrup, that struggle was taken as evidence of need, not harm. Dependence had not yet been named, and without a name it could not be accused. The mother did not see herself as passive. She saw herself as careful, loving, responsible. She followed instructions because she believed in them, and because she had been taught that belief itself was a form of virtue. By the time consequences began to surface, they did so slowly, ambiguously, easily attributed to anything else. Growth spurts, temperament, weak constitution. Nothing pointed clearly back to the bottle on the mantel, and so questioning never fully formed. Not because mothers did not care, but because they had been taught, with great consistency, that care meant trust, and trust meant silence. The quiet came quickly. That was always the most convincing part. Within minutes of the spoon touching the child's lips, the room changed. Breathing slowed. Muscles loosened. The faint, restless sounds that had filled the evening dissolved into nothing at all. The child slept not lightly, not fitfully, but with a heaviness that suggested resolution, the kind of sleep adults longed for and envied. Silence, in Victorian medicine, was taken as proof. A quiet child meant pain had been addressed. A still body meant the treatment had succeeded. There were no instruments yet capable of measuring what occurred beneath the calm surface, no monitors, no long-term studies, no language for what lingered after the immediate effect passed. Medicine relied on what could be seen and heard, and what could be seen was peace. The household learned to read that silence as reassurance. It settled nerves more effectively than any explanation could. In the absence of noise, anxiety had nothing to attach itself to. Doubt softened. The future seemed manageable again. Silence had moral weight in Victorian life. It signified control, discipline, respectability. Children were expected to be quiet, especially at night. A medicine that enforced stillness aligned perfectly with social ideals. It did not disrupt. It did not embarrass. It restored order. No one lingered over the quality of that silence. The child did not dream aloud, did not stir, did not cry out. Sleep was deep and uninterrupted, almost unnaturally so, but the word unnatural never arose. There was no comparison point. Exhausted parents welcomed it. Doctors praised it. Journals recorded it as success. Morning came without incident. The child woke slowly, drowsy but compliant. Appetite was modest. Movements were unhurried. This too was interpreted favorably. Calmness became the new baseline. Energy was no longer expected. Liveliness became optional. Silence extended beyond the night. The child spoke less, played quietly, sat for longer stretches without complaint. Adults praised maturity. Such composure was admired, especially in young children. No one asked whether something essential had been muted along with the pain. The absence of symptoms was mistaken for health, but absence can conceal as much as it reveals. In medical case notes, silence was recorded as resolution. The cough had ceased. The crying had stopped. The sleeplessness had vanished. Nothing further was observed. Nothing further was required. Follow-up was unnecessary when there was nothing left to hear. What no one noticed was how the silence changed over time. When the medicine wore off, restlessness returned more sharply than before. The contrast grew starker. Quiet nights made unsettled ones feel intolerable. The remedy, having proven itself once, was now expected to perform again. Thus silence became conditional. The child's body began to associate calm not with comfort or security, but with the presence of the medicine. Without it, something felt wrong, too loud, too sharp, too exposed. The world pressed in more insistently than before. This was not recognized as harm. It was recognized as recurrence. The solution was obvious. Another spoon. Each return of silence reaffirmed belief. It quieted not only the child, but the questions that might otherwise have formed. Silence does not argue. It does not warn. It does not protest. In a culture that prized order above all else, the quiet after the spoon felt like confirmation that everything had been done correctly. And so the silence spread from the bedroom to the household, from the household to the medical profession, from the medical profession into history itself. For years, there would be little written about what followed those calm nights. Because silence, once achieved, rarely leaves a record, the age believed deeply in advancement. Victorian Britain stood surrounded by proof that the world could be improved. Railways carving through countryside, factories multiplying output, chemistry transforming raw substances into refined solutions. Medicine did not stand apart from this confidence. It was one of its proudest expressions. Pharmacies began to resemble showcases of progress. Glass-fronted cabinets displayed rows of bottles, each labeled with precise typography and scientific authority. Latin names reassured. Measurements implied control. Syrups gleamed under gaslight, like evidence of human mastery over nature's rough edges. Heroin syrup fits seamlessly into this landscape. It was not presented as a gamble or an experiment. It was presented as an achievement. Advertisements spoke of refinement, purity, and predictability. Where opium had been crude and uneven, heroin was precise. Where earlier remedies were harsh, this one was gentle, modern. Doctors embraced it not merely as a treatment, but as a symbol. It represented the triumph of laboratory over folklore, of chemistry over superstition. Prescribing it signaled that a physician was current, educated, aligned with the future rather than the past. Parents absorbed this message without resistance. To accept modern medicine was to participate in progress itself. Refusal would have seemed backward, even irresponsible. In an era where social standing was entwined with one's embrace of improvement, medical choices carried cultural weight. The bottle on the mantel was not merely functional, it was a marker of sophistication. Pharmaceutical companies understood this instinctively. Their language borrowed freely from science and industry, promising reliability, uniformity, and safety. Each bottle was identical to the next. Each dose behaved as expected. This predictability was celebrated as moral good. Variability, after all, was what progress sought to eliminate. Children became quiet testaments to that promise. A calm child was proof that the medicine worked. A sleeping child justified the system that produced the bottle. No one asked whether the proof was incomplete. Success was defined narrowly, conveniently. The idea that progress might contain its own dangers was rarely entertained. Victorian culture framed improvement as linear, inevitable, and benevolent. Mistakes belonged to the past. The future was assumed to correct itself. Medical journals reinforced this belief. Case reports highlighted immediate outcomes. Charts measured symptom reduction. The absence of long-term data was not seen as absence at all, it was simply beyond consideration. The future, it was assumed, would be better by default. Heroin syrup moved quickly from prescription to standard. Its use expanded beyond hospitals into homes, nurseries, and schools. It became part of the domestic medical arsenal, as familiar as cough lozenges or liniments. Its power was normalized through repetition. And with normalization came invisibility. The bottle no longer drew attention. It blended into the background of household life. When a thing becomes ordinary, it stops being questioned. Its presence is taken for granted. Its effects are no longer scrutinized, only expected. Progress, once bottled, is difficult to unbottle. The child who slept soundly under its influence was held up as evidence that medicine had finally conquered discomfort. Pain no longer needed to be endured. Distress no longer required patience. Chemistry could solve what time once had. What progress did not yet recognize was that not all problems were meant to be solved immediately, and not all silence was benign. But such thoughts belonged to a later age, one that would learn, slowly and reluctantly, that improvement without reflection carries costs that do not announce themselves. For now, the bottle remained proudly in view. Progress had arrived, and it tasted sweet. There was no word for it yet. That absence mattered more than anyone understood. Victorian medicine relied on classification. Illnesses were named, catalogued, divided into types and causes. What could not be named could not be diagnosed. What could not be diagnosed could not be treated or blamed. And so the quiet changes unfolding in children who had been given heroin syrup remained invisible, slipping neatly between categories that did not yet exist. When the syrup was withheld, the child did not simply return to their former state. Restlessness came faster now, sharper, edged with a peculiar urgency that felt different from pain. Sleep fractured into shallow intervals. Whimpering returned with an unfamiliar insistence. The body seemed unsettled in ways that no longer matched the original complaint. This was not recognized as a new condition. It was interpreted as the old one resurfacing. Doctors spoke of recurrence, of fragile constitutions, of symptoms returning once treatment ceased. This explanation fit comfortably within existing medical frameworks. It did not challenge the remedy. It justified its continuation. The child, unable to articulate internal sensations, expressed distress through behavior, irritability, agitation, an inability to settle. These were not alarming traits in themselves. Children were known to be changeable, sensitive, difficult at times. The idea that medicine itself might be shaping these responses did not arise. Parents adjusted accordingly. The syrup was reintroduced, sometimes at the first sign of unease. Why wait for suffering when relief was already known? The body responded immediately, calming once more, confirming the decision. Each cycle reinforced belief in the medicine's necessity. What was happening inside the child was more complex than anyone realized. The body had begun to expect the presence of the substance. Without it, the internal balance felt wrong, too sharp, too loud, too exposed. This discomfort was not pain as it had been before. It was absence. But absence has no symptoms that 19th century medicine could recognize. There were no lesions, no fevers, no visible markers, only behavior. And behavior, especially in children, was easy to dismiss. Medical journals occasionally noted cases where patients seemed unusually reliant on certain remedies. The language was vague. Terms like habit or inclination appeared, softened by euphemism. These observations were not connected to children. Addiction, such as it was understood at all, belonged to adults, to moral failure, to excess, not to prescribed medicine given carefully, lovingly, and in measured drops. The idea that a child could become dependent through obedience was inconceivable. Thus, the pattern continued unchecked. The child's body adapted quietly, efficiently, exactly as bodies do. Tolerance developed slowly. Doses that once produced deep calm now produced milder effects. The solution seemed obvious. Maintain the routine, perhaps adjust slightly, perhaps administer more regularly. These decisions were made without fear because there was no framework for fear to occupy. Dependence without a name does not announce itself as danger. It masquerades as need. The child grew older within this cycle. Memory did not extend far enough back to recall rest without assistance. Calm had always arrived from the bottle. Relief had always been delivered externally. The body no longer attempted to resolve discomfort on its own. It had learned that effort was unnecessary. Adults mistook this passivity for gentleness, for good nature, for temperament. No one thought to mourn the resilience that was never allowed to form. When unease returned between doses, it was met with familiar solutions. No alarm sounded. No physician stood back to reassess. There was no incentive to do so. The medicine was doing exactly what it promised, quieting distress, restoring order, delivering peace. What it was teaching the body in the process remained unnamed. And so the most important transformation of all occurred without recognition. The child learned not only that relief came from the spoon, but that relief was something the body could not produce on its own. By the time language caught up to the phenomenon, by the time dependence would be named, studied, and feared, the children who had learned this lesson earliest would already be grown. Their history would not include the word for what had shaped them, because when it began, that word did not yet exist. The transformation was framed as improvement. Where opium had once been spoken of with caution, its bitterness, its unpredictability, its association with vice heroin arrived wearing the language of refinement. It was introduced not as something new, but as something corrected, a solution purified of its past. Victorian chemistry excelled at such rebranding. Raw substances were no longer trusted. Refinement was the mark of progress. To refine was to remove danger, to smooth rough edges, to civilize what nature had left crude. Heroin was presented as opium made respectable, cleaner, more precise, stripped of its excesses. A drug disciplined by science. Doctors repeated this narrative readily. They spoke of molecular alteration, of improved absorption, of reduced side effects. The language sounded authoritative, even when understanding lagged behind confidence. Few questioned whether refinement necessarily meant safety. Fewer still asked what refinement might amplify rather than diminish. Opium had a reputation. It demanded caution. Heroin, by contrast, was marketed as liberation from that caution. Medical journals of the period reflected this optimism. Articles described heroin as less habit-forming, more reliable, better suited for delicate patients. The very groups once thought most vulnerable children, the elderly, the frail, were now cited as ideal recipients. Refinement, after all, implied gentleness. The shift was subtle but decisive. What had once been administered reluctantly was now prescribed comfortably. What had once required justification was now routine. Heroin syrup did not replace opium by force. It replaced it by persuasion. Pharmacists embraced it enthusiastically. Bottles arrived bearing clean labels, precise instructions, and promises of consistency. Unlike opium tinctures, which varied in strength and effect, heroin syrup behaved predictably. This predictability was celebrated as moral progress. Medicine, like industry, valued uniformity above all else. Parents absorbed the distinction without difficulty. Opium belonged to an older world, a world of harsh remedies and uncertain outcomes. Heroin belonged to the present, and therefore to the future. Giving it to a child felt not reckless, but enlightened. The child, of course, did not perceive this lineage. The body responded not to narratives of refinement, but to chemistry itself. Whether crude or purified, the substance acted upon the same systems, altered the same pathways, produced the same fundamental effects. What changed was not the nature of the drug, but the confidence surrounding its use. That confidence proved decisive. Because heroin was framed as safer than opium, its risks were not merely minimized, they were dismissed. Warnings associated with older remedies did not transfer. The past, it was assumed, had been solved. This belief allowed the drug to enter spaces opium never could: nurseries, school infirmaries, bedtime routines. Refinement also shortened memory. By distancing heroin from its origins, medicine severed the historical knowledge that might have provoked restraint. Opium's dangers were known because they had been observed, endured, and named. Heroin's dangers had not yet had time to announce themselves, and refinement ensured they would be given time. Doctors spoke proudly of progress, of how far medicine had come from superstition and suffering. Yet the very act of refinement had concealed continuity. The substance had changed form, but not intent. It still quieted pain by overriding the body's own signals. It still taught dependence, one dose at a time. The difference lay in presentation. Opium had demanded respect. Heroin invited trust. This trust reshaped behavior. Doses were given more freely. Treatment lasted longer. The threshold for administration lowered steadily. Refinement did not merely alter the drug, it altered the rules governing its use. By the time doubts began to surface, heroin had already secured its place as a modern solution. To question it would have meant questioning progress itself. Few were willing to do so. Thus, the path from opium to heroin was not a break, but a smoothing over, a dangerous continuity wrapped in the language of improvement. And in that smooth transition, caution was not defeated, it was forgotten. Refinement, after all, does not announce what it preserves. The rooms were clean. That, above all else, inspired confidence. Victorian laboratories were spaces of order and intent, glassware aligned, benches scrubbed, instruments arranged with almost ceremonial care. White coats replaced aprons, and with them came an air of moral authority. Cleanliness implied control. Control implied safety. Inside these rooms, substances were transformed. Alkaloids were isolated, compounds refined, reactions measured and repeated. The work was meticulous, methodical, and increasingly divorced from the bodies that would one day receive the results. Chemistry became its own discipline, governed by rules that did not require observation of lived experience. Heroin emerged from this environment as an achievement of process rather than outcome. It behaved correctly in tests. It produced predictable effects. It dissolved and combined as expected. From the perspective of the laboratory, it was a success. What the laboratory did not provide was consequence. The work of chemists was evaluated by purity, yield, and reproducibility. These were the metrics that mattered. If a compound could be produced consistently, if it acted reliably in controlled conditions, it was deemed suitable for application. The human body was assumed to be another system, more complex perhaps, but fundamentally obedient to the same principles. This assumption went largely unchallenged. Testing, such as it existed, focused on immediate response. Did the substance suppress cough? Did it reduce pain? Did it induce sleep? These questions were answerable within hours. The results were recorded, published, celebrated. Longer questions, what happened after days, weeks, months, were left unanswered, not out of malice but because no structure existed to ask them. There was no requirement to follow a child home, no mandate to observe a body adapting over time, no expectation that a remedy's effects might unfold slowly, invisibly. The laboratory's success ended at the threshold of the clinic. Once a substance passed into medical use, responsibility diffused, doctors prescribed, pharmacists dispensed, parents administered. Each step carried trust forward, but none carried accountability backward. If problems arose, they were attributed to patient variability, not to the substance itself. This diffusion of responsibility insulated the laboratory from doubt. Chemists continued refining, improving, perfecting. Their work was praised in journals and lectures, held up as evidence of civilization's march forward. They were not asked to consider the moral dimensions of their creations. That was not their role. Their task was to make things that worked. Heroin worked. In this environment, restraint appeared unnecessary. Caution belonged to older sciences, to eras without measurement or method. Modern chemistry, it was believed, could see what earlier generations could not. Precision replaced humility. Calculation replaced patience. The absence of immediate catastrophe reinforced this belief. Children did not collapse in the streets. Families did not riot. The consequences, such as they were, unfolded quietly, privately, dispersed across countless households. No single case was dramatic enough to challenge the narrative of success. Laboratories recorded triumph. Homes absorbed aftermath. When early concerns did surface whispers of unusual reliance, cases of inexplicable agitation. When medicines ceased, they were filtered through existing frameworks. Perhaps the compound was being misused. Perhaps doses were incorrect. Perhaps certain patients were unsuitable. The substance itself remained blameless. After all, it had been refined. The laboratory had done its part. It had isolated, purified, improved. It had delivered a product that behaved as expected under controlled conditions. What happened beyond those conditions was not its concern. This separation between creation and consequence defined much of Victorian medicine's blind confidence. Knowledge was compartmentalized, responsibility fragmented. The system functioned smoothly precisely because no one was tasked with seeing the whole. Heroin syrup flowed outward from the laboratory into the world, carrying with it the authority of science and the assurance of refinement. Its journey did not loop back. Feedback did not return. Effects did not inform design. And so the laboratories continued, immaculate and assured, unaware that their greatest oversight was not chemical but human. Consequences, after all, rarely appear in controlled environments. The pages were orderly, margins aligned, language precise, conclusions measured and optimistic. Victorian medical journals carried themselves with the same quiet confidence as the laboratories and clinics they represented. They were not places for doubt. They were places for confirmation. Case reports favored clarity over complexity. A child presented with cough. A syrup was administered. The cough ceased. Outcome: favorable. The narrative required no embellishment. Calm was the result, and calm was success. Editors prized such reports. They were efficient, reassuring, and aligned neatly with the prevailing faith in progress. A remedy that produced silence, sleep, and compliance was easy to praise. It fit the Victorian ideal of medicine as a civilizing force, one that brought order to disorder, quiet to chaos. What the journals rarely included was time. Symptoms were tracked until they resolved, not beyond. Follow-up was brief or absent altogether. Once calm was achieved, the case effectively ended. There was no expectation that treatment might alter the patient in ways that extended past the immediate outcome. Medicine was episodic, not longitudinal. Each illness stood alone, detached from what came before or after. Heroin syrup thrived in this environment. Reports described children who slept soundly after administration, whose coughing subsided, whose agitation disappeared. Words like effective, gentle, and well-tolerated appeared frequently. The absence of distress was equated with absence of harm. No further commentary seemed necessary. Negative outcomes, when they appeared at all, were softened by language. A child described as irritable after cessation of treatment was said to have a sensitive disposition. Restlessness was framed as temperament rather than reaction. Dependency, lacking a formal definition, did not qualify as a medical phenomenon. The journals did not lie. They simply did not look long enough. There was also professional pressure. Physicians who published were expected to contribute to the advancement of their field. Reports that raised questions without offering solutions risked appearing unhelpful, even obstructive. Medicine was moving forward, and journals were its record. To dwell on uncertainty was to slow the narrative of improvement. Calm, therefore, became the preferred endpoint. The child who slept quietly through the night was proof that medicine had done its work. The doctor who restored silence was successful. The journal that recorded this success validated the system as a whole. Each layer reinforced the next. What was missing from these pages were the quieter stories, the ones that unfolded slowly, without clear boundaries. The child who grew dependent, the family that noticed unease between doses, the gradual dulling of affect that no longer registered as illness, but as personality. These experiences did not fit the format of a case report. They were diffuse, ambiguous, resistant to measurement. Medical writing favored what could be isolated. As heroin syrup spread through practice, its presence in journals multiplied. Repetition gave the appearance of consensus. The more often a remedy was praised, the less likely it was to be questioned. Familiarity bred authority. By the time dissenting observations emerged, they were drowned in a sea of favorable accounts. A few cautious notes could not outweigh dozens of reports celebrating immediate relief. The journals had already decided the story they were telling. Calm had become not just an outcome, but a value. In valuing it so highly, medicine overlooked what calm concealed. The journals recorded silence, but they did not listen to it. They noted sleep, but did not ask what kind of sleep it was. They celebrated absence of noise without considering what else had been removed. Thus, the written record of the era became a mirror that reflected only what medicine expected to see. The deeper consequences, the ones that required patience, humility, and time, remained unwritten. History, for a while, would take the journals at their word. Because what is praised repeatedly begins to feel unquestionable. They were small. That was the advantage. Victorian medicine favored bodies that complied, and no bodies complied more readily than those of children. Small patients required smaller doses, produced fewer complications, and rarely questioned authority. They did not articulate discomfort in ways that challenged medical language. They accepted what they were given, or they did not survive long enough to argue otherwise. To physicians of the era, this made children ideal subjects for treatment, not in the experimental sense, but in the practical one. Children responded quickly. Their symptoms shifted visibly. Their outcomes appeared decisive. A child who slept after medication was an unambiguous success. There was no need to interpret subtle verbal feedback or conflicting accounts of sensation. The body spoke through silence, and silence was easily understood. Children also lacked history. Adult patients arrived carrying habits, vices, and moral interpretations that complicated treatment. Dependency in an adult could be framed as weakness or indulgence. In a child, such judgments seemed inappropriate. Any unusual behavior could be attributed to development, temperament, or immaturity. This ambiguity protected medicine from scrutiny. When heroin syrup was administered to children, it produced clean results. Coughs ceased, crying stopped, sleep arrived. The body did not resist. It adapted quickly, efficiently, without complaint. For a profession eager to demonstrate effectiveness, these outcomes were irresistible. Medical journals took note. Children were increasingly described as responding remarkably well to treatment. Their delicate systems were said to benefit from gentler remedies, from refined compounds that acted swiftly without visible harm. Heroin, positioned as safer than opium, seemed tailor-made for such patients. The logic was circular but convincing. Because children were fragile, they required refined medicine. Because refined medicine worked quickly, children appeared to benefit most. Because children improved visibly, the medicine was deemed successful. Few questioned whether the appearance of improvement was the whole story. Children did not report craving. They did not name unease. They did not explain the peculiar agitation that arose when medicine was withheld. Their distress manifested as behavior, restlessness, irritability, crying, and behavior was easily medicalized into recurrence. The treatment that had worked before was administered again. The cycle reinforced itself. Adults noticed that children calmed more completely than grown patients. They slept longer. They seemed almost emptied of resistance. This, too, was framed positively. A calm child was easier to care for. A compliant child was evidence that the medicine was appropriate. No one asked whether the child had been given a chance to learn endurance. Children were also socially invisible in ways adults were not. Their long-term outcomes did not immediately affect productivity, reputation, or public order. A child who grew quiet did not raise alarms. A child who became subdued did not threaten social norms. The consequences, if they came at all, would come years later beyond the horizon of immediate responsibility. This temporal distance mattered. Victorian medicine operated on short timelines. Illness was treated, symptoms resolved, cases closed. Children's futures lay outside this frame. The notion that early intervention could shape adult lives was not yet fully integrated into medical thinking. Childhood was seen as a phase to be managed, not a foundation to be protected. Thus, children absorbed the risks that adults might have resisted. Parents, too, were more willing to accept intervention for children. The fear of suffering in the young outweighed abstract concerns about unknown effects. A quiet night felt urgent. A peaceful child felt like success. The future remained theoretical. Doctors reassured them easily. Children, they said, healed quickly. Their bodies were resilient. Any effects would pass. Growth itself was believed to correct imbalances. This faith in natural recovery paradoxically justified more aggressive intervention. Children became the ideal patients not because they were understood, but because they were adaptable. Their bodies learned quickly, learned to rely, to expect, to wait for relief delivered externally. Medicine mistook this adaptability for robustness. It was not until years later, when those children became adults carrying patterns that no longer fit simple explanations, that the flaw in this logic began to surface. By then, the treatment of children had already written its quiet legacy one dose at a time, in bodies too young to object, and in a system convinced that silence meant success. Victorian medicine excelled at the immediate. It addressed what could be seen, measured, and corrected within a narrow window of time. A cough that stopped, a child who slept, a night restored to quiet. These were outcomes that fit neatly within the profession's frame of reference. What lay beyond that frame, weeks, months, years into the future, remained largely unexamined. This was not cruelty, it was structure. Medical training emphasized intervention, not aftermath. Physicians were taught to identify symptoms, apply remedies, and move on. The notion that a treatment's most significant effects might emerge slowly, subtly, and cumulatively did not yet hold institutional weight. Medicine treated episodes, not trajectories. Heroin syrup benefited enormously from this limitation. When a doctor prescribed it, success could be observed almost immediately. Relief followed within minutes. The patient slept. The family rested. The physician's role was complete. There was no expectation of return unless symptoms recurred, and when they did, the recurrence was interpreted not as consequence, but as confirmation of the original diagnosis. The future was not part of the calculation. Children, especially, existed outside long-term medical imagination. Their bodies were believed to be self-correcting, elastic, capable of absorbing intervention without permanent effect. Growth itself was thought to erase imbalance. Whatever passed through a child, it was assumed, would leave no lasting mark. This belief was deeply comforting. It allowed decisive action without hesitation. It excused repetition. It transformed unknown risk into theoretical concern. Parents absorbed this assurance readily. When doubts flickered briefly, quietly, they were soothed by the same logic. Children change constantly. Today's behavior would not be tomorrow's. A child who needed help now would outgrow the need later. The medicine was temporary. Everything was temporary, except the lessons the body was learning. Each dose reinforced a pattern. Each instance of relief taught the body how discomfort was resolved. Over time, these lessons accumulated, shaping expectations at a level no one yet knew how to observe. But because no one was looking that far ahead, nothing appeared wrong. Medical records closed cleanly. A successful case required no addendum. In journals and lectures, physicians spoke of outcomes in the present tense. The patient improved. The symptoms resolved. The treatment proved effective. There was no space reserved for what might unfold later, no mechanism for revisiting conclusions once drawn. Medicine moved forward, not backward. Even when unease arose in adulthood, when former child patients struggled with restlessness, anxiety, or inexplicable reliance on certain substances, those struggles were never traced backward. Childhood treatments were not interrogated. They belonged to a different chapter, already closed. The absence of long-term thought also protected reputations. If harm could not be immediately linked to a specific action, responsibility remained diffuse. Doctors had acted according to best knowledge at the time. Parents had followed instructions. Pharmacists had dispensed approved remedies. No single hand held the future firmly enough to be blamed. This diffusion created comfort. It allowed confidence to persist. Heroin syrup remained in circulation not because its long-term effects were unknown, but because they were unasked. The system had no incentive to pursue questions that might complicate its own success. Immediate relief was visible, marketable, and professionally rewarding. Slow harm was none of these things. Children grew within this blind spot. Their early experiences with medicine shaped their relationship to discomfort, relief, and control in ways that would only become visible later, often decades later, when the original context had been forgotten entirely. By then, the trail was cold. Victorian medicine did not lack intelligence. It lacked patience. It lacked the conceptual tools to imagine consequences unfolding beyond the moment of intervention. The future was assumed to be kinder, wiser, and corrective. Progress itself was expected to solve what it caused. And so long-term thought remained absent, not because it was impossible, but because it was inconvenient. The medicine worked now. That, in the Victorian mind, was enough. The visit was brief, decisive, and final. That was the pattern. Victorian doctors did not linger. Their authority lay in diagnosis and prescription, not in prolonged observation. Once a remedy had been given and immediate results achieved, the case was considered closed. A successful intervention required no return. This absence was interpreted as confidence. The doctor's work, after all, had been done. The child slept, the cough subsided, the tears stopped. These were visible outcomes, undeniable and swift. To return without cause would suggest uncertainty, or worse, doubt in one's own judgment. Victorian medicine valued certainty too highly for that. Thus, the doctor moved on. Households learned to read this absence as reassurance. If something were wrong, surely the doctor would have said so. If danger existed, it would have been named. Silence from authority was taken as confirmation that all was well. The child, meanwhile, continued to change. Between visits, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, new patterns formed quietly. The medicine's effects no longer felt remarkable. They felt necessary. Restlessness emerged sooner when doses were delayed. Sleep fractured without warning. Unease crept in without a clear cause. These developments were subtle, gradual, and easily absorbed into daily life. No physician stood beside the cradle to notice them. When families did summon a doctor again, it was usually for a familiar reason. The cough had returned. The child was irritable. Sleep was poor. The doctor arrived, assessed the symptoms as recurrence, and reaffirmed the original treatment. There was no reason to question what had already proven effective. The cycle reinforced itself. Doctors did not follow children over time. They did not chart behavioral shifts or emotional flattening. Such things were not considered medical data. The profession concerned itself with disease, not disposition. If a child grew quieter, that was not pathology. It was temperament. And so, the most important changes went unrecorded. Victorian medicine was episodic by design. Each visit addressed a moment, not a narrative. The child was not seen as a developing organism shaped by cumulative experiences, but as a series of isolated conditions. What linked those conditions together, what persisted beneath them, remained invisible. Heroin syrup thrived within this structure. Because no single visit revealed harm, harm could not be acknowledged. Because no doctor stayed long enough to witness adaptation, adaptation was not recognized as dependency. The system rewarded immediate solutions, not sustained attention. Doctors also trusted one another implicitly. A prescription written by a colleague carried professional weight. To question it would be to question the judgment of the field itself. Continuity of care, such as it existed, reinforced consensus rather than critique. The physician who first prescribed the syrup did not see the child years later. The physician who later observed unusual agitation did not know the full history. Each acted within a narrow frame, unaware of the larger pattern forming across time and households. No one returned to connect the dots. This absence of return also shielded medicine from responsibility. If no doctor remained present long enough to see consequences unfold, those consequences could be attributed elsewhere to family circumstances, to moral weakness, to innate sensitivity. The remedy itself remained untouched. Parents, left without ongoing guidance, relied increasingly on routine. The bottle became a stand-in for professional oversight. Doses were adjusted intuitively. Timing was modified for convenience. The medicine integrated itself into domestic life more deeply than any visiting physician ever could. In this way, the doctor's absence paradoxically increased the medicine's authority. Without a human presence to question or revise its use, the syrup became self-justifying. Its effects spoke for it. Its silence was its defense. By the time medicine began to consider long-term outcomes seriously, the structure that had enabled heroin syrup's rise was already deeply entrenched. The harm had been distributed across time, across households, across childhoods. There was no single moment to point to, no single decision to reverse. Doctors had not returned because they believed they did not need to. The medicine had worked. And in Victorian medicine, that was the end of the story, even when it was only the beginning. The excitement was quiet, but it was everywhere. Victorian medicine did not celebrate its breakthroughs loudly. It savored them with restraint, with lectures delivered in measured tones and papers published in sober journals. Yet beneath that composure ran a current of exhilaration. For the first time, the body seemed legible. Pain could be interrupted. Sleep could be induced. Chemistry could reach inside the human frame and change outcomes on command. This power was intoxicating. Doctors spoke often of restraint, but their era rewarded novelty. Each new compound promised not merely treatment, but mastery. The 19th century had inherited centuries of helplessness. Plagues endured, fevers waited out, suffering accepted as inevitable. Now, at last, medicine could act. To act decisively felt like progress itself. Heroin syrup arrived at precisely the right moment. It did not demand dramatic intervention or surgical skill. It required only a prescription, a spoon, and trust. Its effects were immediate and visible. In a profession hungry for proof of efficacy, this was irresistible. The calm that followed administration felt like validation not just of the drug, but of the entire scientific worldview that had produced it. Physicians spoke of discovery with reverence. New compounds were discussed as milestones, each one marking distance from the ignorance of the past. To question a discovery too early was to risk appearing regressive, timid, or worse, unscientific. Medicine, like industry, was moving forward. Those who hesitated risked being left behind. The profession rewarded confidence. Doctors who embraced new treatments were seen as modern, capable, aligned with the future. Those who clung to older remedies were quietly dismissed as conservative, even obsolete. Progress had become a measure of competence. In such an environment, doubt felt dangerous. When heroin syrup produced silence and sleep, it reinforced the belief that medicine had finally found its footing. Pain no longer needed to be endured. Childhood no longer had to be noisy or uncertain. Chemistry offered order where chaos once reigned. No one paused to ask what else was being altered in the process. Medical training emphasized mechanisms, not meaning. How a drug acted mattered more than how it was experienced. The body was increasingly viewed as a system to be regulated, not a story unfolding over time. If a compound produced the desired effect, it was considered successful. Heroin did exactly that. The profession's enthusiasm was not reckless in appearance. It was cloaked in data, in case reports, in careful language. But enthusiasm need not be loud to be consuming. It can reside in assumptions, in what is not questioned, in what is treated as settled before it truly is. Doctors spoke often of discovery as destiny. Each new substance was another step toward a future where suffering could be controlled entirely. This vision left little room for humility. To suggest that a refined compound might carry hidden risks was to challenge the narrative of inevitable improvement. Thus, concerns were deferred, not denied outright, but postponed. There would be time later to examine long-term effects once immediate benefits had been fully realized. The present demanded action. The future could wait. Children, again, bore the cost of this confidence. Their bodies became sites where discovery met daily life. The profession observed results without witnessing repercussions. The calm child reinforced belief. The absence of immediate harm quieted unease. Discovery fed on its own success. Medicine had not lost its ethics. It had narrowed them. In focusing so intently on what could be done, the profession lost sight of what should be asked. Discovery became its own justification. Each success demanded the next, and restraint came to feel like stagnation. Heroin syrup was not prescribed out of malice or neglect. It was prescribed because the profession believed deeply in its own trajectory. It trusted that progress corrected itself, that science refined away danger as it advanced. This belief would not be challenged until the consequences of discovery could no longer be ignored, until patterns emerged that could not be explained by temperament, constitution, or coincidence. By then, the profession would look back on this era with unease, recognizing in its quiet confidence the early signs of intoxication, not with drink, but with discovery itself. Pain was no longer a teacher. In Victorian medicine, it had become an obstacle, an inefficiency to be removed as swiftly as possible. For centuries, discomfort had been accepted as part of living, particularly in childhood. Teething, coughing, restlessness, sleepless nights, these were endured, soothed with patience and proximity rather than chemistry. Pain marked growth. It signaled change. It demanded attention, but not necessarily intervention. The 19th century altered that understanding. As medicine gained tools that could interrupt sensation, pain itself was redefined. It ceased to be informative and became adversarial. A symptom that lingered was not something to interpret, but something to defeat. Relief was no longer the end of suffering, it was proof of medical competence. Heroin syrup embodied this new posture perfectly. It did not negotiate with pain. It silenced it. The effect was immediate, decisive, and deeply satisfying to a profession eager to demonstrate control. A child who stopped crying was not merely comforted, they were corrected. The body had been brought back into line. This shift carried profound consequences. Pain had once forced observation. A restless child required watching, holding, responding. Discomfort invited care that was relational and adaptive. When pain could be erased chemically, that relational labor diminished. The medicine replaced the process. Doctors encouraged this transition subtly but consistently. They spoke of unnecessary suffering, of how no child should be left to endure what science could relieve. Endurance was reframed as cruelty. Intervention became moral duty. Parents absorbed this message eagerly. Who would choose discomfort when relief was available? To allow a child to cry when a spoon could still, the sound felt negligent, even heartless. Pain became something to fix immediately, not something to sit with. The child learned this lesson first. Discomfort no longer signaled a state to be endured. It signaled an error, something wrong that required immediate correction. The body learned not to tolerate sensation, but to reject it. Relief was not the end of pain, it was the expected response. This expectation reshaped development in ways no one yet measured. Minor sensations that might once have passed unnoticed now felt intolerable. The threshold for discomfort lowered steadily. The child became less resilient, not because of weakness, but because resilience was no longer required. The body had been taught that chemistry would intervene. Pain's role as a guide was erased. Medical language reinforced this erasure. Journals praised remedies that eliminated symptoms completely. Partial relief was inferior. Persistence of sensation suggested failure. The ideal outcome was silence, total, immediate, unquestioned. In pursuing this ideal, medicine lost nuance. Pain was not always destructive. It could signal healing, adaptation, growth, but such distinctions complicated the narrative of progress. Simplicity was preferred. Heroin syrup offered simplicity. The child who cried stopped crying. The cough quieted. Sleep came without struggle. These outcomes were not merely comforting, they were aesthetically pleasing. Order replaced disorder. Quiet replaced noise. Control replaced uncertainty. No one asked what happened when pain was removed too efficiently, when the body was never allowed to interpret, respond, or adapt on its own. No one asked whether the absence of pain might carry its own cost. To question pain's eradication would have sounded regressive. Medicine had worked too hard to escape an age of helplessness. To reintroduce discomfort as valuable felt like retreat. Thus pain became the enemy, and heroin syrup a trusted weapon. The child, now calm and compliant, embodied the victory. A still body was proof that medicine had triumphed. The future consequences of that victory remained invisible, deferred, unnamed. In erasing pain, Victorian medicine believed it was protecting childhood. It did not yet realize it was also erasing something else, the body's ability to understand itself without intervention. That loss would surface later, in ways far harder to silence. In Victorian medicine, the body was a machine to be instructed, and symptoms were its language. When a cough shook a child's chest or agitation wriggled through their limbs, these signals were not mysteries, they were commands, and the command had been clear: cease. With heroin syrup, the child's body learned to obey swiftly, without negotiation. The first administration was always the most decisive. A measured spoon pressed to the lips, the dark syrup swallowed, and the body responded immediately. Breathing slowed, muscles relaxed, eyes closed, limbs stilled. The room exhaled with the child. Calm was produced on command, as if the body had been rehearsed for this very moment. It was evidence that the system worked. It was proof of control. Doctors praised such obedience. They recorded outcomes in journals with detached precision. Cough subsided, restlessness ceased, sleep achieved. The child's compliance confirmed the efficacy of the intervention. The medicine acted, the symptom obeyed, the household believed in the authority of the doctor. Each link reinforced the others. Confidence circulated like a gentle current through the home, through the clinic, through the society that trusted expertise. Parents, for their part, felt relief as an absolute. A quiet child was proof of success. No one questioned the means. The result was undeniable. Routine stabilized around the observed behavior. Sleep schedules, meals, even playtimes adapted to the predictable rhythm of the syrup. The household learned to anticipate obedience as naturally as it anticipated sunrise. Predictable bodies made predictable homes. But the obedience of symptoms came with a subtle cost, invisible at first. The body learned not merely to quiet itself, it learned to require direction. When the medicine was delayed or withheld, symptoms did not simply persist, they intensified. Restlessness arrived sooner, coughs became harsher, agitation emerged with sharp insistence. The system that had been trained to comply now demanded its stimulus. Calm became conditional, obedience required intervention. Medical journals did not yet recognize this phenomenon. What returned between doses was labeled recurrence, relapse, or fragile constitution. The notion that the body had learned a new expectation, an expectation of chemical intervention, was unthinkable. Children were too young to be studied longitudinally. Dependency was unnamed, invisible, and thus impossible to record. Observation stopped at success. No framework existed for the patterns forming beneath the surface. Even socially, obedience reinforced authority. A child who followed instructions quietly, who slept when told, who appeared well, embodied the moral and scientific ideals of the household. Calm was a virtue, compliance a sign of proper upbringing. The medicine confirmed both the household's care and the profession's mastery. It was difficult, almost unthinkable, to frame obedience as a problem. Yet the body remembered. Each cycle of compliance and reward trained systems that adults could not see. Pain signals, agitation, and discomfort were rewritten in terms of expectation. Spoon first, relief second. No dose, resistance intensified. Calm became an external condition, not an internal one. Obedience depended on intervention. Thus, symptoms themselves became instruments of learning. They taught the body to wait, to anticipate, to rely. The child learned to obey before the cue arrived. Restlessness itself became a messenger, demanding compliance to the patterns set by adults and enforced chemically. Victorian medicine celebrated this obedience. It was visible, it was immediate. It fit neatly within the journal's strict lines and margins. No one yet considered what obedience meant beyond the immediate moment, how it shaped behavior, expectation, and adaptation over years. A child whose symptoms obeyed was a triumph. A household whose order was restored was evidence of progress. But beneath the measured drops, beneath the sweet syrup, beneath the calm gaze of adults, a quiet lesson was taking hold. The body would follow, but only when guided, and the guidance would come not from its own signals but from the spoon. Science in Victorian England was seldom questioned. It moved with deliberate certainty, measured by charts, journals, and lectures delivered in hushed lecture halls. Authority was built upon observation, repetition, and, most importantly, confidence. To doubt what was published was to place oneself outside the civilized circle of progress. Medicine, in particular, carried this weight. A remedy that worked once was presumed to work always. A protocol followed precisely was assumed infallible. Heroin syrup exemplified this principle perfectly. It arrived in households as a scientific marvel, a distilled promise of calm and control. Its effects were immediate and observable. A child slept where once they had cried. A cough softened where once it had rattled like a bell. Relief was not theoretical. It was visible, measurable, undeniable. And because the effect was so obvious, doubt seemed unnecessary. Why question what could be seen with the eye? Why hesitate when the evidence lay before one on the nursery bed? Doctors spoke confidently of the compound's virtues. In journals it was described as refined, reliable, and safe, a testament to the triumph of modern chemistry. Observations were recorded without speculation, conclusions drawn without hesitation. The language reinforced certainty. The patient responded favorably. The remedy is effective. No adverse events observed. Nothing about the phrasing invited reflection on what might lie beyond immediate observation. Science, in these accounts, was absolute. Parents absorbed this certainty as naturally as they administered the syrup. They had been trained by society, by domestic guides, and by the authority of their own physicians to accept without question. The doctor had said it was safe. The journals had confirmed it. Other households practiced the same routines. Obedience to instruction felt not only proper but essential. Questioning medicine risked appearing negligent or backward. Trust was woven seamlessly into the domestic fabric. And the children, for their part, obeyed the rules silently. They had no language for doubt, no understanding of the forces shaping their rest and wakefulness. Their bodies learned a simple equation: spoon equals relief, calm follows. Repetition, ingrained expectation. Compliance became instinct, and the lesson that relief required external administration settled deeply. Science, without doubt, was particularly seductive because it offered certainty in an uncertain world. Childhood illness had once been fraught with unpredictability. Fevers rose and fell without reason. Teething produced inconsolable wails. Coughs lingered for days. Parents were anxious, physicians were cautious, and outcomes were inconsistent. Heroin syrup promised control. Its effects could be observed. Its power could be measured. The illusion of mastery was complete. Yet the system carried hidden assumptions: that what worked once would work always, that the absence of immediate harm implied absence of lasting harm, that bodies, especially young ones, were malleable but resilient. Science did not yet consider adaptation, accumulation, or consequence over time. It demanded immediate results and interpreted them as ultimate truth. Thus, unquestioned confidence became its own feedback loop. Doctors observed obedience, recorded success, praised innovation, and encouraged repetition. Parents trusted what they saw and what they were told. Children learned to depend on the spoon. And the journals, silent witnesses to each household's compliance, echoed the same certainty back into the professional and social spheres. Science, without doubt, had a particular elegance. It simplified reality, excised ambiguity, and granted authority. But in the quiet nurseries of Victorian homes, it also allowed a subtle lesson to be taught: that calm was proof, obedience was virtue, and the body itself could be shaped quietly, chemically, and irrevocably, without reflection, without hesitation, and without doubt. The room was quiet, save for the faint hiss of the gaslight and the soft tick of the mantel clock. The child lay motionless beneath a heavy blanket, small chest, rising and falling, with a regularity that seemed almost unnatural. The silence was complete, the calm convincing, and yet there was an undercurrent no one yet recognized, a body trained not to resist, a mind too young to question, and a life quietly being reshaped by chemical instruction. In the early days, stillness had been the goal. A restless child meant worry, fatigue, and the perception of failure. Sleepless nights disturbed the household, frayed nerves, and attracted the judgment of neighbors. Each whimper, each cough, each twitch of discomfort was a reminder that the child's body was not yet aligned with the expectations of society. Medicine offered control. Heroin syrup promised quiet. Calm became not merely relief, but the proof of proper care. The first spoonful was transformative. Limbs slackened, the small fists unclenched, and eyes closed without protest. Breathing slowed, deep and even, as though the body itself recognized that the disturbance had been corrected. To the adults observing, this was success incarnate. The problem had been solved. The household exhaled. Order had returned. The child, still and obedient, embodied both efficacy and authority. Yet the very stillness that was celebrated concealed something deeper. The body had learned to accept relief as externally imposed rather than internally generated. Restlessness no longer resolved itself through natural means. Discomfort was no longer endured. The child had learned that calm arrived from the spoon, from the measured drops, and not from adaptation or resilience. Dependence was being written into the body's physiology without name or recognition. Mothers observed with relief. Fathers nodded in approval. The house was restored to proper rhythm. The bedroom, once filled with agitation and low cries, now radiated the order prized above all else. Visitors might have assumed the child naturally docile, the household practiced, the medicine innocuous. No one questioned the subtle transformation occurring beneath the skin. Medical texts reinforced the perception of success. Journals recorded cases where children, when treated with heroin syrup, became quiet almost immediately. Words like well-tolerated, responsive, and effective dominated reports. No long-term follow-up was considered necessary. The child's obedience validated the system. The absence of struggle was celebrated as virtue. Silence itself became a marker of health. Yet the stillness carried consequences. Over time, agitation when doses were delayed became sharper, more insistent. Sleep fractured if the spoon was withheld. The child's body came to anticipate intervention. Calm was no longer intrinsic, it was conditional. Dependence was forming quietly, invisibly, a lesson learned before the language to describe it existed. The paradox was complete. The still child represented both triumph and subtle transformation. The household viewed peace as proof of care, while medicine took the obedience of symptoms as confirmation of success. Yet in that obedience lay a deeper truth that the child's body, molded by repeated chemical intervention, had begun to relinquish natural mechanisms of resilience. Calm had become expectation, and expectation had become reliance. In the hush of the nursery, the lesson was unspoken but insistent. Comfort arrives not through effort, endurance, or self-regulation, but through the measured drops of a dark, glossy syrup. And the stillness, however serene it appeared, was only the first chapter in a lifetime quietly shaped by authority, trust, and chemistry. The child sat at the small wooden table, the spoon poised but untouched, eyes still heavy from the long night of rest induced by the previous dose. Breakfast, once a lively affair of porridge and bread, now unfolded with quiet compliance rather than eagerness. Appetite had shifted subtly over the weeks, almost imperceptibly, until nourishment became routine rather than desire. The body, trained to expect external intervention for relief, no longer asserted its cravings with the clarity it once had. In Victorian homes, a healthy appetite was considered both evidence of growth and a moral marker. Children who ate heartily were praised as robust and obedient, their vigor reflecting well on the household. But the arrival of heroin syrup subtly rewrote these expectations. When restlessness, discomfort, and minor ailments were quelled by chemical means, the body no longer needed to signal its needs as insistently. Hunger, once a natural prompt for attention and care, diminished in urgency. The child accepted portions quietly, finished meals out of routine rather than enthusiasm, and moved on with a calmness that, to adults, seemed ideal. Mothers observed this change with approval. A child who consumed food without fuss, who did not argue or resist, embodied virtue and propriety. Fathers praised the household's order. The quiet behavior reinforced their confidence in the prescription, in themselves, and in the doctors who had advised them. The absence of complaint was interpreted as success, though what was absent had grown far beyond mere appetite. Doctors, when consulted, framed the reduced enthusiasm for food as evidence of improvement. Less distress at the table, less fussing over minor discomforts, indicated that the child was healthier, calmer, and more stable. Journals lauded cases in which children were described as well-mannered at meals following doses, praising the medicine's ability to regulate both sleep and daytime behavior. No one questioned whether the diminishment of desire was a natural consequence or an imposed calm. Observed outcomes were sufficient, underlying mechanisms were irrelevant. The change in appetite unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly. Each day the child became quieter, more composed, less inclined to assert bodily needs. Hunger, like agitation, became negotiable only through intervention. Each measured dose of syrup reinforced the lesson. Comfort, calm, and satisfaction could be administered externally. Internal signals were increasingly redundant. The body waited rather than demanded. Yet beneath this quiet surface, subtle shifts occurred. The child's metabolism, digestion, and energy patterns began to adapt to external regulation rather than innate need. Desire became conditioned to timing and dose, not to internal rhythms. Meals, play, and sleep were all quietly subordinated to chemical control, teaching reliance before the child could name the lesson or understand it. The syrup had reshaped behavior beyond symptom management. It had begun to mold expectation itself. In Victorian eyes, this was progress. Children were compliant, well-behaved, and orderly. Meals were uneventful. Mornings proceeded with calm efficiency. No cries, no tantrums, no resistance. Household routines flowed smoothly. Parents, assured by appearances, felt competent and attentive. The child seemed healthier, easier, and more civilized. What was unrecognized, however, was the cost hidden beneath the measured calm. Appetite had once been an expression of instinct, a prompt for self-regulation and engagement with the world. Now it had been quieted into acquiescence. The child's body learned to accept sustenance without desire, comfort without effort, and relief without self-generated struggle. The absence of internal assertiveness had become the new normal. Thus, the fading of appetite was more than a culinary shift. It was a lesson in expectation, compliance, and dependence. A body taught to wait, to accept, and to obey before it could speak, before it could question, and long before anyone named the subtle transformation quietly unfolding beneath the veneer of health and propriety. The child's limbs lengthened, as all limbs must, but with a quiet deliberation that seemed almost deliberate. Each morning, the small body greeted the day with an appearance of vigor, yet beneath the surface, subtle changes had begun. Weight lagged behind height, cheeks remained pale where once they had flushed with color, and movements carried a measured restraint that was praised by adults but unremarkable to the child. Victorian observers read this stillness as refinement, self-control, or delicate constitution. They did not yet see it as consequence. Growth had long been a matter of patience, of observation, and of endurance. Children were expected to weather illness, teething, and minor injuries, to experience discomfort as a natural element of maturation. Their bodies learned to adapt, to recover, to resist. But heroin syrup had quietly rewritten the terms of that experience. By suppressing agitation, pain, and even the small struggles of daily life, the medicine removed stimuli that the body might have used to strengthen itself. Resistance, once an integral part of growth, was chemically softened. The child moved through development more quietly, more compliantly, and with less internal initiative. Parents, meanwhile, interpreted the change as virtue. Their child was calm, obedient, and serene. Comparisons with other children, noisier, more demanding, more restless, reinforced the perception that calmness equaled well-being. Mothers took pride in the quiet efficiency of care. The child ate on schedule, slept on schedule, and rarely protested or required correction. Fathers noted the visible order of the household and the apparent health of the child. The slow pace of physical growth went largely unnoticed, or was attributed to constitution, temperament, or refinement. Medical authorities shared this perspective. Journals recorded outcomes in terms of symptom suppression rather than holistic development. A child who slept, ate, and appeared healthy was described as thriving. The absence of dramatic complaints was interpreted as evidence that treatment had succeeded. Follow-up rarely extended beyond the immediate resolution of visible distress. Growth, measured only in the immediate, was assumed to be progressing adequately. The long-term ramifications of repeated chemical intervention were invisible to both observation and record. The child's body, however, internalized the lessons of compliance. Muscle tone adapted to reduced exertion, energy expenditure lessened. Small challenges that might once have prompted natural physical adaptation, restlessness, agitation, minor fevers were quelled by external intervention. Each dose of heroin syrup reinforced a pattern. The body learned to wait for aid rather than generate its own responses. Physiological processes once stimulated by ordinary life now remained latent, quietly reshaped by chemistry. The lesson extended beyond the physical. Resistance, effort, and self-regulation were no longer necessary for comfort or relief. The child's development, previously guided by a balance of challenge and recovery, now followed the rhythm imposed by adult intervention. Time, observation, and natural consequence were replaced by the predictable cycles of spoon and syrup. Growth became measurable not in vitality, but in compliance. Yet outward appearances reassured all observers. The child was quiet, clean, and manageable. Limbs extended. Sleep arrived predictably. Appetite was sufficient, if subdued. There was no immediate alarm. The household accepted the subtle slowing of growth as natural, necessary, or even desirable. The medicine had done its work. The child complied. The body obeyed. And all remained orderly. Beneath this calm, however, a subtle truth was taking root. Growth, once a product of resilience, endurance, and engagement with the world, had been guided along a chemically enforced path. Development continued, but in a constrained, softened, obedient form. The child moved forward through life, measured and quiet, never realizing that each drop of syrup had left an indelible lesson. Obedience, dependence, and compliance etched into the very processes of the body itself. The child's eyes opened in the morning, pale and untroubled, reflecting a serenity that pleased every adult who looked upon them. Laughter, once spontaneous and eruptive, now arrived in muted intervals, tempered and cautious. Frustration appeared only briefly. Curiosity restrained itself to the narrowest channels, and cries of discomfort, once a child's natural language, were all but absent. Heroin syrup had rendered the body obedient. It had begun, imperceptibly, to shape the mind. Emotions, once vibrant and erratic, were now disciplined by chemical intervention. Victorian households interpreted this transformation as virtue. A quiet child was a compliant child. A calm child was a healthy child. A child whose moods were predictable was a child properly nurtured. Mothers felt pride. Fathers nodded approvingly. Domestic order was preserved. Visitors admired composure. Even teachers, when the child ventured into school or social settings, noted the unusual steadiness. In every sense that adults valued, the child was exemplary. What no one realized, what no one yet named, was that this emotional stillness had been cultivated deliberately, softly, with each measured dose. Emotional expression, like physical growth, had once been a form of learning. Anger, fear, and frustration were signals to test boundaries and discover limits. Curiosity prompted experimentation, risk, and adaptation. Laughter expressed delight, surprise, or relief. The small crises of childhood tantrums, sudden crying, uncooperative movements were moments in which the mind and body learned negotiation, resilience, and self-regulation. Heroin syrup did not merely quiet discomfort. It removed these formative signals. The child's affect became flattened, measured, and predictable. Doctors, when consulted, interpreted this flattening as stability. Journals praised the medication for producing children who were settled, gentle, and well-behaved. The professional language emphasized outcomes over internal experience. A child who cried less, argued less, and responded calmly to minor provocation was described as thriving. Observation focused on compliance rather than the quality of inner life. The child's obedience confirmed the efficacy of both treatment and modern medicine. Parents absorbed this validation. A child who no longer erupted in unpredictable frustration required less attention and fewer interventions. Routine ran smoothly. Household labor was easier. Domestic stress was reduced. Emotional flattening, interpreted as maturity or temperament, was mistaken for achievement. The child's quietude became evidence of effective care and competent guardianship. Yet beneath this calm, subtle risks accumulated. Emotional learning requires friction, moments in which disappointment, discomfort, or failure provoke adaptation. Without such moments, the child's affect became conditioned to external regulation rather than internal discernment. Restlessness, agitation, or cries no longer served as internal cues. They were signals for adult intervention, chemical and authoritative. The mind learned that emotion was to be managed by others. Autonomy, even in miniature, was eroded. The syrup produced a body trained to obey and a mind subtly conditioned to expect obedience. Calm became both expectation and reward. Distress was minimized, flattened, and neutralized before it could develop into independent problem-solving or self-regulation. The child's personality, once a tapestry of instinct and reaction, was smoothed into a uniform surface, polished for social acceptability and controlled for domestic convenience. In this era, such quietude was celebrated. A child who expressed less, reacted minimally, and remained subdued was considered exemplary. The household could function without interruption, and medical authority was validated through visible calm. The flattening of emotion was unremarkable, even desirable. Yet, as the child grew, these lessons persisted. The body and mind had been conditioned in tandem. One learned to obey, the other to anticipate obedience from outside. Spontaneity, exuberance, and unmediated feeling were quietly diminished. Emotional life, once rich and self-directed, had been supplanted by chemically enforced tranquility. The cost was invisible, unremarked, and unrecorded, but it was real. The child who slept, who ate quietly, who obeyed instinctively, had become the ideal patient not merely of medicine but of the household itself. And in the stillness of the nursery, that ideal was indistinguishable from virtue. The child arrived at school each morning with the same quiet composure that had become habitual at home. Limbs moved obediently, steps measured and restrained. Eyes were attentive but never restless. Hands were still during lessons, obedient to authority rather than impulse. To the teachers, this was ideal. Such a child was easily guided, compliant, and most importantly, predictable. No commotion disrupted lessons. No tantrums drew attention away from instruction. Everything proceeded smoothly, according to plan. Teachers praised what they could see. Attendance was reliable, participation measured. Obedience was rewarded with approval and commendation. Comparisons with other pupils reinforced the perception. Children who cried, protested, or fidgeted were difficult, unruly, or poorly supervised. Quiet, still children were excellent students. Their calmness reflected well on those in charge: the household, the mother, and the physician who prescribed the remedies that enabled such comportment. Yet what the teachers failed to notice was subtle, invisible, and cumulative. The quiet obedience was not merely temperament or upbringing, it was the product of chemical intervention. Heroin syrup had quieted not just the symptoms of discomfort, but the expression of innate need. Restlessness, irritability, and minor rebellion, normal signals of engagement and adjustment, were muted. The child's affect, energy, and initiative were reshaped before anyone had a chance to see them as meaningful or instructive. In the classroom, this invisible shaping went unnoticed, precisely because it fit expectations. Victorian pedagogy valued order above exploration. A child who listened silently, wrote carefully, and followed instructions precisely embodied the ideals of discipline and attentiveness. Teachers were rewarded for maintaining control and for cultivating compliance. They had no reason to question why some children were unusually still, unusually quiet, or unusually compliant. What lay beneath the surface was irrelevant, so long as outward behavior met the standards of propriety and decorum. The child, meanwhile, adapted instinctively. Responses that would once have been immediate, emotional, or instinct-driven were now moderated, delayed, or absent. Internal cues, hunger, discomfort, curiosity, irritation, were subordinated to external patterns of expectation: a spoon for relief, a schedule for meals, a teacher's instructions for engagement. Over time, the body and mind learned to anticipate external correction rather than generate their own. The child's attention became disciplined, not through insight, but through enforced calm. Occasionally, teachers noticed subtle deviations. A child might stare longer at an object, hesitate before responding, or display faint distress at unfamiliar stimuli. These anomalies were noted sparingly, often dismissed as shyness, delicacy of constitution, or natural temperament. Journals and reports emphasized compliance and order. Nuanced interpretation was neither required nor encouraged. Even in higher grades, when observation could have revealed the long-term consequences of early chemical intervention, the pattern persisted. Teachers evaluated children by the standards of visible performance and social conformity, not by the subtle markers of internal adaptation or reliance. A child who had been soothed chemically was indistinguishable in behavior from one naturally calm, and thus escaped scrutiny. The invisibility of chemical shaping created a feedback loop. Teachers praised quietness, parents administered medicine to maintain it. The child continued to obey. Each reinforcement solidified the lesson. Stillness was rewarded, initiative muted, discomfort deferred. The classroom, designed to educate and observe, became complicit in the subtle conditioning begun at home. Thus, in the neat rows of desks and the polished floors of Victorian schools, a generation of children learned to comply and to endure quietly. Teachers noted nothing beyond observable behavior, unaware that the child's calm reflected not only social propriety, but the quiet power of a spoonful of syrup, a shaping influence that would echo far beyond the walls of the classroom, long after the lessons were done. Even when the child appeared calm, there remained traces of unease that no one spoke of aloud. Heroin syrup had quieted coughing, stilled restlessness, and delivered sleep, but the underlying susceptibility persisted, hidden beneath the veneer of order. Victorian observers, trained to prize appearances over subtlety, interpreted the absence of complaint as health, yet the body remembered. Illness, in its quiet, lingering form, never fully departed. The cough that had once rattled through nights now returned sporadically, softer but more insistent in its timing. Teething discomfort receded, only to re-emerge as mild irritability, quickly smoothed over by syrup. Even minor fevers, once alarming, were anticipated and preemptively treated. Each symptom that recurred was met with measured drops, administered without hesitation, without question. Relief arrived instantly, and adults interpreted the compliance as resolution. The child had not healed in the conventional sense. The symptoms had merely been managed into silence. Victorian households interpreted this ongoing quiet as proof of vigilance. Parents believed themselves capable, attentive, and morally responsible. They followed the prescriptions precisely, confident that the intervention was appropriate and necessary. Doctors had given authority. Journals had validated practice. The subtle persistence of illness was invisible, unremarkable, and easily ignored. It did not disrupt the household. It did not challenge the perception of health. Yet the body absorbed these interventions. Each preemptive dose taught the systems within to anticipate chemical relief, rather than rely on innate resilience. The immune response was dulled, the pain threshold lowered, the mechanisms of self-regulation quietly overwritten. The child, having been trained to obey, no longer learned to endure symptoms naturally. Illness became a teacher replaced by the spoon, a signal requiring immediate external correction. Medical journals recorded compliance and immediate outcomes with satisfaction. A child who slept, whose cough softened, whose agitation disappeared, was considered successful. Long-term follow-up, if it existed at all, focused narrowly on survival or the absence of overt complications. Subtle alterations in growth, emotional expression, or adaptive resilience were not measured. No one questioned that repeated dosing might shape physiology in ways beyond the visible. The lingering traces of illness were interpreted not as consequence, but as variability in temperament or constitution. Parents, observing only behavior, failed to perceive the slow accumulation of reliance. When the body signaled discomfort, the response was swift and unquestioned. Administer the syrup. Restlessness, agitation, and low-grade fevers no longer prompted observation, reflection, or adaptation. They prompted intervention. Over time, the child's physiology learned to signal only in the terms that had been reinforced chemically: quiet, compliance, and expectation of relief. This created a cycle. Symptoms returned, medicine silenced them, calm was rewarded, compliance was reinforced, and yet the illness, subtle and persistent, never truly left. It existed in the intervals between doses, in the body's latent anticipation, and in the unobserved adaptations that would shape behavior and health far into the future. Victorian medicine judged success by the absence of complaint, by observable calm, by immediate relief. The ongoing, hidden presence of susceptibility was invisible. The child appeared healthy, ordered, and manageable, yet beneath the surface, the body retained memory of discomfort, reliance, and chemical shaping. Illness had been quieted, not erased. Thus, even in the homes, classrooms, and clinics of Victorian England, the patient's calm was both triumph and illusion. Relief had been delivered, authority reinforced, and appearances maintained, but illness had never fully left. It persisted quietly, waiting in the spaces between doses, shaping the child in ways unseen, unrecorded, and largely unrecognized. The clock ticked steadily in the nursery, though the rhythm of time mattered little compared to the rhythm of expectation. Restlessness had returned, subtle at first, a shifting of small limbs beneath the blankets, a flicker of eyelids, a soft, almost imperceptible whimper. The child, conditioned over weeks and months, had learned the pattern instinctively. Discomfort arrived, and with it came the anticipation of relief. The bottle on the mantel, dark and glossy, waited patiently for its cue. It was always the same. One spoon, carefully measured, delivered precisely, and the body complied. Calm returned within minutes. Breathing slowed, muscles relaxed, eyes closed. The household exhaled in relief. Order had been restored. The cycle, simple and unremarkable to adults, was profound for the child. Each administration reinforced not just obedience, but expectation. The body learned to anticipate intervention before discomfort had fully formed, shaping response before sensation had concluded. Parents acted quickly, guided by the lessons of previous nights. They had been trained by authority, by science, and by domestic experience to recognize the earliest signs of unrest. A flicker of unease was sufficient to summon the spoon. Delay was discouraged, as it risked intensifying agitation and fracturing sleep. Each repetition strengthened the association. Pain or restlessness was to be addressed immediately, chemically, rather than endured or resolved naturally. Doctors, distant but omnipresent in authority, had instilled this confidence. Journals and pamphlets reinforced the notion that timely intervention was both necessary and virtuous. To wait was negligence, To observe without acting was folly. Heroin syrup became the measure of proper care, the instrument through which adults expressed competence and morality. A calm child validated both medicine and household. Yet beneath the stillness lay adaptation. The body, repeatedly soothed before challenge could escalate, began to rely on the external cue. Signals that once prompted internal regulation, mild discomfort, restlessness, agitation, now demanded chemical response. The need for another spoon was no longer occasional. It had become expected. Calm was no longer a natural state, but a condition imposed externally. The lesson, learned silently and without explanation, was clear. The body must obey, and relief must arrive from without. Teachers, too, noticed the effects, though they could not trace their origin. The child arrived at school obedient, measured, and subdued. Where peers displayed bursts of energy, curiosity, or frustration, this child remained quiet. Calm, in the classroom, appeared as virtue. Yet it was a product of habit reinforced by chemical expectation, not innate temperament. The spoon's lesson had traveled beyond the nursery, shaping conduct in every space the child occupied. The need for another spoon was thus both literal and symbolic. It represented dependence, anticipation, and the subtle conditioning that had taken hold over weeks of quiet, measured administration. Each administration reinforced authority, normalized intervention, and deepened the cycle. The child's body no longer relied on internal cues to manage discomfort. It relied on instruction, ritual, and chemical intervention. Victorian observers interpreted this entirely differently. Calm was proof of health. Obedience was evidence of proper upbringing. Parents were diligent, doctors were correct, and the household maintained its order. The cycle of spoon and stillness seemed ordinary, even desirable. Yet beneath appearances, the body had learned a new truth. Relief was always external, obedience was paramount, and the next spoon was inevitable. Thus the child awaited, unconsciously, for the next dose. And when it arrived, measured, sweet, and deliberate, calm returned once more, proof to all observers and instruction to the body that the cycle would continue, day after day, until the lesson had been fully absorbed. The child had learned a simple equation. Discomfort arrived, and relief followed. Over weeks and months, this lesson was reinforced tirelessly, each instance embedding itself quietly within the body and mind. Heroin syrup had taught more than sleep or stillness. It had taught expectation. The child no longer waited for rest, for comfort, or for recovery. Relief was no longer a possibility, it was inevitable, delivered from without, predictable and immediate. Parents, trained by instruction and reinforced by the visible calm of their children, came to trust this pattern unquestioningly. A small whimper, a cough, a frown, any subtle signal of discomfort was enough to summon the bottle, the spoon, the measured dose. There was no hesitation, no reflection, and no doubt. Relief arrived first. The body learned not to endure, but to wait. The mind learned not to anticipate, but to rely. This conditioning was subtle, insidious in its quiet efficiency. Each administration was framed as care, a benevolent intervention, a moral act. The child, obedient by necessity and instinct, internalized the lesson before language could name it. Pain was no longer a teacher. Restlessness was no longer a guide. Comfort came externally, chemically, and without negotiation. The child's own mechanisms of resilience, long regarded as natural and necessary, were slowly suppressed, overwritten by repetition and expectation. Teachers, neighbors, and extended family noted the effect with satisfaction. Quiet, compliant children were praised for their temperament, their discipline, and their maturity. They were measured against peers whose natural restlessness or complaints seemed disruptive or improper. Calm became a standard by which success was judged. The very traits that had once marked individuality, crying, protest, impatience, were now interpreted as failure. The children who had learned relief first were ideal, observable proof that both medicine and household were functioning correctly. Medical authorities reinforced the lesson. Journals chronicled cases in which children responded quickly, calmly, and predictably to the syrup. Words such as well-tolerated, responsive, and settled appeared repeatedly. Immediate results were taken as validation, and no attention was paid to the gradual shaping occurring beneath the surface. Long-term consequences were ignored, considered beyond the scope of the observations, or irrelevant to the defined measure of success. Relief, achieved first, became the only standard that mattered. Yet, the body remembered more than the adults realized. Each dose taught timing, expectation, and compliance. Restlessness no longer had the power to provoke adaptive responses. Pain no longer signaled the need for internal action. The child's physiology adapted to anticipate intervention, forming patterns that would persist long after the adults assumed the lesson had ended. Relief had been taught as the primary strategy for survival, and the body, eager to comply, embraced it fully. By the time children reached ages at which memory, judgment, and reflection could begin to operate independently, the expectation of externally delivered comfort was deeply ingrained. Autonomy had been subtly circumvented. Effort, endurance, and adaptation, once essential to development, had been deferred indefinitely. Relief had been learned first, and in doing so, it became dominant. Parents, teachers, and physicians interpreted these outcomes as exemplary. The child's calm demeanor, obedience, and apparent health reinforced their confidence and validated their actions. No one recognized that the body had been trained to expect comfort before struggle, to prioritize external intervention over internal resolution, and to accept dependency as normal before the word for it existed. Thus, in Victorian nurseries across the city, children learned first and foremost a quiet, chemical truth: that relief was not something to be earned, struggled for, or generated within, but something delivered, predictable, and inevitable. And it was this lesson, absorbed in silence, reinforced by routine, and invisible to the observers, that would shape the body and mind far beyond the comforting hours of childhood. The child moved with a calm that seemed almost unnatural, yet entirely ordinary to Victorian eyes. Limbs extended obediently, gestures measured and restrained. Breathing was even, facial expressions subdued. The body had been trained not by discipline, not by force, but by the silent insistence of chemistry administered with care and precision. Heroin syrup had become both tutor and authority, teaching the body to obey before the mind could question, before instinct could protest. In the quiet of the nursery, the lesson unfolded subtly. Discomfort arose, as it always would, but the body had learned the pattern. Restlessness prompted anticipation, agitation demanded preparation. By the time the spoon arrived, the child's physiology was primed to accept it. Muscles loosened, pulse slowed, sighs escaped involuntarily. Relief was expected. Compliance had become instinctive. The body no longer generated resistance. It had learned to wait for intervention, to align itself with the adult timetable of care. Parents observed this transformation with satisfaction. The child was calm, manageable, and orderly, qualities highly prized in a society that equated control with propriety. No one remarked on the quiet training that had taken place, nor on the subtle alterations to the body's natural rhythms. Limbs moved smoothly, energy levels remained subdued, and minor discomforts no longer provoked struggle. To adults, this obedience was evidence of proper upbringing and effective medicine. To the child, it was reality, the only reality it had known for months, sometimes years. Doctors, meanwhile, reinforced the lesson without ever witnessing it directly. Journals chronicled children who responded predictably to treatment, praising the reliability and gentleness of heroin syrup. Immediate outcomes were emphasized. The slow shaping of physiology went unrecorded. Medicine celebrated the obedience of the body, interpreting calm as evidence of efficacy. In practice, each administration of syrup became both treatment and reinforcement, training the body to respond in precisely the way observers expected. The child's physiology adapted in ways that remained invisible. Internal signals, hunger, agitation, pain, were interpreted through the lens of learned expectation. Muscles, nerves, and reflexes responded not merely to sensation, but to the memory of chemical intervention. Agitation that once prompted self-regulation now triggered anticipation for relief. Sleep that once emerged organically now arrived only after the cue of the spoon. Autonomy, subtle and unspoken, had been supplanted by compliance. Even in the classroom, the effects were evident. The child who had been trained to obey chemicals arrived quietly, moving predictably from one activity to the next. Where peers displayed bursts of curiosity or impatience, this child remained measured. Teachers interpreted such behavior as virtue, as discipline, as evidence of refinement. No one considered that this obedience had been chemically instilled rather than internally chosen. The syrup's lesson had traveled beyond the nursery, shaping behavior in every context the child inhabited. This training was cumulative and invisible. Each dose reinforced the expectation that calm would be delivered externally. The child's body learned that discomfort was temporary, predictable, and always resolved through adult intervention. Resistance became unnecessary. Pain, restlessness, and agitation were no longer signals to adapt. They were reminders that relief would arrive, chemically, precisely, and reliably. In Victorian eyes, this was progress. Order had been restored, and children were docile, calm, and manageable. Yet beneath the measured limbs, the steady breathing, and the obedient posture, the body carried a quiet truth. It had been trained to obey, shaped by chemistry before instinct, and conditioned to expect intervention before it had learned to endure. The lesson was complete, invisible, and irreversible. By the mid-19th century, the pattern was evident across nurseries in every borough and every household that could afford guidance from a physician. Children, once animated with bursts of energy, cries, and curiosity, now exhibited a uniform calm that was admired and recorded as evidence of proper care. Heroin syrup, administered with care and precision, had not only quelled symptoms but quietly trained an entire generation to accept external authority as the arbiter of comfort. Calm had become natural, obedience instinctive, and resistance unnecessary. Each administration reinforced lessons beyond the immediate. Restlessness was not merely pacified, it was rewritten into expectation. A frown signaled attention, not adaptation. A cough signaled a routine response, not an independent system seeking balance. Over weeks and months, the body learned that its own signals were insufficient, that calm would not emerge from effort, from adjustment, or from endurance. Relief was something to be received, not generated. The child's physiology, intertwined with chemistry and habit, had absorbed the lesson with the quiet inevitability of repetition. Parents observed this change with approbation. Quiet children were considered disciplined, healthy, and morally upright. Mothers noted the smoothness of bedtime, the ease of feeding, and the lack of fuss during lessons or chores. Fathers commended the household for its order and predictability. Even the broader community, when observing children in schools or public spaces, reinforced the perception. Calm, compliant, children were exemplary. The lesson had been validated socially as well as chemically. Medical authorities, journals, and texts perpetuated the framework. Cases recorded in neat columns praised outcomes in terms of observable obedience. Children slept, ate, and performed according to expectation. The language emphasized efficacy rather than experience. Long-term consequences were not discussed. Slow adaptations within the body, alterations to temperament, or emerging dependencies were invisible or assumed to be minor. Success was defined by what could be seen immediately. The children themselves internalized the pattern before language could define it. Discomfort was no longer a call to adapt. Restlessness was no longer an impetus to engage with the body's own regulation. Sleep, calm, and comfort were understood not as results of self-generated effort but as delivered conditions. The body waited, primed, obedient. The mind observed, internalizing compliance as natural. Autonomy, subtle and emergent, had been overridden by expectation. In classrooms, nurseries and homes, the quiet perpetuated itself. Children who might once have resisted, protested, or demanded attention now waited for the adult cue. Their learning, play, and engagement unfolded within the parameters, dictated by expectation and chemical intervention. Calmness became both a virtue and a habit. Those who resisted, whose bodies acted outside the learned pattern, were regarded as fragile or difficult. Compliance had become the measure of propriety. Yet beneath the visible calm lay a deeper truth. The bodies had been trained to accept reliance before understanding, to anticipate intervention before self-regulation, to obey before instinct. Resilience had been deferred. Experience had been curated chemically. The generation had been quieted before it could assert itself independently. In Victorian households, this silence was celebrated. It reflected care, authority, and mastery over the unpredictable. The child was easier to manage, the household more orderly, the medicine validated, but beneath every calm breath and obedient movement, the lesson endured. Relief came not from effort, observation, or natural adaptation, but from the measured spoon and the authority it represented. And in learning that lesson so early, an entire generation had been quietly reshaped, their bodies and minds calibrated for obedience long before the world demanded anything else. The first murmurs of concern arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the hushed corridors of Victorian medicine. For decades, children had been soothed, quieted, and rendered obedient with chemical precision, and the results were celebrated in journals, case notes, and lecture halls. Calm was proof, compliance evidence, and measured drops were treated as instruments of virtue. Yet now, subtle patterns began to emerge, patterns that could not be ignored indefinitely, even in a profession intoxicated with progress. The doctors who began to notice were not loud or alarmist. They were careful observers, steeped in the culture of restraint that defined their profession. They recorded their findings in precise language. Children appear unusually subdued. Agitation emerges abruptly when doses are delayed. Appetite and vitality seem diminished. These statements, measured and factual, hinted at a new reality, one that had been quietly unfolding beneath the surface of every orderly nursery. At first, these observations were met with skepticism. How could a medicine that had produced such immediate and visible relief be responsible for anything more subtle? Calm was still achieved. Obedience was still evident. Families remained satisfied, and journals continued to record outcomes in terms of compliance rather than internal state. Yet the notes persisted. Individual cases, when examined over months rather than hours, suggested that the body had begun to expect intervention, to anticipate the spoon, and to respond in its absence with agitation. The symptom no longer reflected illness alone. It reflected pattern and training. Physicians began to compare records across patients and across households. Patterns appeared. Children who had received repeated doses of heroin syrup required intervention sooner and more frequently. Restlessness, agitation, and even mild distress no longer arose spontaneously. They were triggered when the chemical expectation was unmet. Calm, which had once been spontaneous after illness, now arrived primarily when the intervention occurred. The body had learned not only obedience but reliance. These realizations were unsettling. Victorian medicine prized immediate results. Success was measured in observable outcomes: sleep, quiet, compliance. Long-term adaptations, subtle shifts in temperament, and anticipatory responses were not yet formalized metrics. To acknowledge them required reconsidering assumptions that had guided practice for decades. Yet some doctors could not ignore what they observed. Conversations in lecture halls became cautious. Senior physicians discussed cases with colleagues in low tones, careful to separate observation from accusation. They described the emerging phenomenon as habit formation, sensitivity to repeated intervention, or latent dependence. The language was tentative, hedged, but it carried weight. Within these whispers lay the recognition that medicine, even when executed with precision, could shape not just symptoms, but the underlying architecture of childhood experience. Parents remained unaware. They continued to celebrate calm, obedient children, interpreting minor agitation between doses as temporary discomfort. Teachers noted compliance in the classroom. Journals praised efficacy. The broader culture remained convinced that measured drops and chemical intervention were benevolent, progressive, and correct. And yet the doctors who began to notice understood the truth. The calm and obedience had come at a cost. The body had learned dependence before awareness. Relief had been taught before resilience. The child's autonomy had been quietly circumvented. Observation, once limited to immediate symptoms, now revealed a deeper lesson that medicine itself had been imparting silently, for years, without acknowledgement or intention. In hushed offices and behind closed doors, Victorian physicians confronted a subtle paradox. The medicine that had produced unquestionable calm had also begun to teach the child to need it, and no amount of discipline, reassurance, or measured drops could undo the lesson already learned. The quiet child, calm under the scrutiny of both household and physician, presented an illusion of completion. On the surface, the cough had ceased, the agitation stilled, sleep restored. Yet beneath the veneer of order, subtle symptoms persisted, returning in forms so faint that they could easily be overlooked. These were not dramatic crises, but a slow, insistent pattern that refused to resolve. Victorian medicine, trained to prize immediate outcomes, struggled to interpret them. The earliest cases were unremarkable individually. A child might awaken briefly, restless, before the prescribed dose of syrup. Appetite might diminish slightly, movements become more measured, emotional responses less spontaneous. Each instance was framed as temperamental or minor, an anomaly in an otherwise obedient body. Yet, when viewed cumulatively, patterns emerged that could no longer be dismissed. Symptoms did not disappear entirely. They merely shifted, transformed by the very intervention that was supposed to quell them. Doctors began to notice these lingering signals in case notes. Journals recorded them with cautious phrasing. Residual irritability noted between administrations. Agitation returns more promptly than in previous cases. Child appears subdued even in absence of overt symptom. The language was careful, measured, and devoid of alarm, reflecting the professional insistence on calm observation. Still, these notes hinted at a deeper truth. The child's physiology had begun to anticipate chemical intervention. Relief was no longer contingent on the natural course of discomfort. It had become expected, required, and demanded. Parents rarely interpreted these signs as concern. The child remained quiet and compliant for the most part. Meals were consumed with little protest. Lessons in the classroom were followed obediently. Outward appearances were reassuring, and adults had been conditioned, like the children themselves, to equate calm with health. The subtle persistence of symptoms went unnoticed, overshadowed by the immediacy of compliance. Each dose of heroin syrup reinforced the lesson. When in doubt, administer. The need for intervention became normalized, and the body's signals were no longer allowed to unfold autonomously. Within the medical community, the cases that would not resolve prompted private reflection, if not immediate action. Physicians spoke in hushed tones of habit, latent dependence, and sensitivity to repeated administration. Some questioned whether the medicine, while effective in the short term, might be shaping the body's natural mechanisms of adaptation. Others dismissed these concerns, reasoning that calm and compliance were paramount, and that any subtle, long-term consequences could be addressed in future generations, when understanding had caught up with practice. Yet the persistence of symptoms was more than a clinical curiosity. It revealed the body's memory, its internalization of chemical intervention. Restlessness no longer emerged as a signal for independent adjustment. It had become a prompt for external correction. Agitation and minor discomfort were no longer challenges to be endured. They were cues to summon the spoon. The child's physiology had begun to rely on the intervention itself, a dependence that remained invisible to adults yet profoundly formative. In every nursery, the pattern repeated. Calm was restored repeatedly, reinforcing obedience and compliance. Yet the underlying lesson endured. The body, once quieted chemically, remembered the spoon, anticipated its presence, and learned to expect relief rather than produce it. Cases that would not resolve became evidence not of disease, but of training subtle, persistent, and unrecognized. Victorian medicine, intoxicated with its own success, had not yet grasped that the very treatment celebrated for producing calm had begun to shape the children themselves in ways no immediate observation could capture. In the hushed corridors of Victorian clinics, whispers began to form a language of concern that was careful, measured, and restrained. It was not alarmist, for alarm would have undermined authority, nor was it dramatic, for drama implied uncertainty. Instead, physicians and pharmacists began to note observations in precise, almost antiseptic terms. The child appears unusually subdued between administrations. Restlessness returns sooner than expected. Appetite diminished compared with peers of similar age. Each phrase was deliberate, carrying the weight of observation without accusation, a subtle acknowledgement that not all was as it should be. The language itself reflected the culture of the profession. Words were chosen to avoid moral judgment, to avoid suggesting negligence, and to preserve the authority of both medicine and caregiver. Habit replaced dependency. Sensitivity replaced vulnerability. Delicate constitution replaced caution. In this coded phrasing, concern existed, but it did so in a form that could never fully challenge the practices it described. The observations were framed as exceptions, not patterns, as curiosities, not imperatives. Parents, when presented with these notes or whispered cautions, interpreted them through the lens of obedience and propriety. Their children were calm, compliant, and manageable. Discomfort, when it appeared, was brief and easily soothed. The subtle language of concern did not disrupt their understanding of health. It was background noise, a faint echo of medical attentiveness, rather than a call to reconsider the very foundation of care. Calm continued to be proof, compliance evidence, and measured drops instruments of virtue. Yet the doctors who first noticed these patterns understood more. They observed that the child's body was no longer operating purely on innate signals. Restlessness, agitation, and minor discomfort were no longer triggers for self-regulation, they were prompts for chemical intervention. Sleep, appetite, and emotional response had become conditioned to the presence of the spoon. The child's physiology had internalized expectation. Relief was no longer a reward, but a constant, anticipated requirement. In lecture halls and private consultations, physicians began to discuss these findings with caution. The language of concern was applied carefully, always qualified, often hedged. We note these behaviors, though their long-term significance remains unclear. Or, The child responds predictably to treatment, yet exhibits heightened sensitivity when doses are delayed. These statements balanced observation with deference to established practice. They acknowledged deviation without condemning the system that produced it. The journals, too, began to reflect this tentative awareness. Articles included footnotes about recurrence of symptoms, anomalies in response, and unusual patterns of compliance. Yet the main narrative remained intact. Heroin syrup was effective, safe, and appropriate. Immediate calm and obedience overshadowed subtle, longitudinal signals. The language of concern existed in the margins, visible only to those trained to read between the lines. The subtlety of these observations was its protection. By framing the concern as minor, conditional, or uncertain, medicine preserved the authority of practice. Parents and colleagues could recognize the language without feeling compelled to act differently. Calm was still achieved, obedience was still observed. The children remained quiet and compliant. The lesson of the spoon continued to be taught, even as its consequences were noted cautiously in words that softened their impact. Thus a generation was observed, partially understood, and quietly shaped. Concern existed, but only as language, not as action, not as reform, not as interruption. Medicine had begun to notice, but it had not yet acted. The child, meanwhile, continued to learn the same lesson every evening and every morning. Relief would arrive, compliance was expected, and the world operated best when obedience preceded instinct. For decades, heroin syrup had been celebrated quietly, almost ceremoniously, as a marvel of Victorian medicine. It promised calm, obedience, and immediate relief. Its sweetness, measured drops, and predictable effects made it ideal for households seeking control over childhood's inevitable unrest. Physicians praised its refinement, parents trusted it unquestioningly, and journals recorded its successes with meticulous care. Yet, even as the substance circulated with authority, its reputation began to shift subtly, cautiously, in whispers and footnotes rather than proclamations. The first signs of unease appeared in clinical observations. Children who had once accepted the syrup with minimal agitation now exhibited minor, persistent restlessness when doses were delayed. Appetite sometimes faltered. Emotional responses seemed flattened, delayed, or absent. The very obedience that had been celebrated as evidence of efficacy now suggested an unexpected consequence: dependence, though it had no name yet. Doctors recorded these patterns with careful hedging. Habit may be forming. Sensitivity observed requires further monitoring. The language was restrained, but the meaning was clear to those trained to read between the lines. Parents, as yet, remained unaware of the implications. Calm children were praised, compliance interpreted as health, and minor deviations dismissed as temporary or idiosyncratic. To families, the syrup continued to function as intended, a means of control, a pathway to order, a reassurance that the household was attentive and morally competent. The reputation of the remedy, until now untarnished, remained outwardly intact. Yet within the professional sphere, the perception began to shift. Early reports of dependence, subtle withdrawal symptoms, or unusual sensitivity during administration challenged the narrative that had long been unquestioned. Physicians debated the significance, emphasizing the rarity of extreme outcomes, the lack of immediate harm, and the continuing success of short-term interventions. Even as they acknowledged anomalies, their focus remained on calm, observable results. The concern was present, but circumscribed an undercurrent beneath the dominant story of efficacy. Heroin's refinement, once celebrated as proof of progress, now drew scrutiny. Its chemical precision, which had allowed predictable dosing and immediate compliance, revealed a paradox. The very properties that made it effective also facilitated reliance. The body, trained to expect intervention, had adapted. Relief had become conditional. Compliance was no longer a choice. The medicine had taught dependency before it had taught understanding. Medical journals began including footnotes, cautious mentions that reflected the growing awareness. Repeated administration may alter behavior. Children demonstrate increased need for subsequent doses. Long-term consequences uncertain. These passages were rare, often buried in appendices or brief case discussions. They did not dominate the discourse. They only hinted at a broader reality, one that could not yet be reconciled with prevailing assumptions of progress. Despite these early observations, heroin's reputation remained largely positive. It still represented the triumph of chemistry over crude remedies, of refinement over uncertainty. It was still prescribed for delicate children, for sleepless nights, for coughing fits, because its immediate effects were undeniable. The shift in reputation was slow, cautious, partial, a recognition that all was not entirely as it appeared, but not yet a condemnation. Thus, the paradox endured. The medicine that had brought calm and obedience was now noted, quietly, for the subtle ways it reshaped the body and mind. Its reputation remained strong in the public eye, even as a quiet, growing awareness spread among physicians. Heroin syrup was no longer merely a remedy. It was an influence, shaping expectation and dependence long before the consequences could be fully understood. The lesson was becoming apparent. What healed in the moment could alter the child beyond it, and progress itself carried shadows that even the most careful observers could not yet name. The morning was still, the nursery quiet, yet beneath the measured calm a subtle tension had begun to emerge. The child stirred with an unfamiliar insistence, eyelids fluttering, small fists pressing against the blankets. Restlessness had returned more sharply than before, yet there was no apparent cause. The spoon had been delayed, not by oversight but by circumstance, a late breakfast, an interrupted household routine, and the body reacted immediately. Withdrawal, though unrecognized by parents or physicians, was underway. Victorian medicine had no language for it. The word withdrawal did not exist in common parlance, and the subtle symptoms it produced were easily misattributed. Parents described agitation as fretfulness, restlessness as delicacy, irritability as sensitive temperament. The child, conditioned over weeks and months to expect relief from chemical intervention, had learned the rhythm of compliance, and the absence of the usual dose was disorienting. The body itself had begun to anticipate intervention, shaping its responses around expectation rather than intrinsic need. Doctors who noticed these moments recorded them with hesitation, in footnotes or as side observations. Agitation observed when dose delayed. Response returns after administration. The language was careful, precise, and devoid of judgment. It acknowledged the phenomenon without naming it. Without a framework to interpret these signs, withdrawal remained an invisible event, a silent lesson embedded in physiology and behavior. The effects were subtle but cumulative. Small movements became sharper, gestures more urgent. Breathing quickened, eyelids blinked rapidly, and minor sounds, a cough, a murmur, emerged as if amplified. These responses, while brief and easily calmed, marked a shift in the child's experience of the body. Calm was no longer spontaneous. Relief was no longer internal. The child had learned that comfort arrived only when delivered externally. Parents, meanwhile, interpreted these symptoms through the lens of prior experience. Agitation meant that the child was tired, irritable, or mildly unwell. They reached for the spoon, administered the syrup, and calm returned almost instantly. To the household, the sequence confirmed the medicine's efficacy. The child's distress appeared as proof that intervention was necessary, not as a consequence of prior doses. Dependency remained invisible, unrecorded, and unnamed. In classrooms and social settings, the phenomenon was equally undetectable. Children who had learned to expect relief first continued to behave with calm compliance when doses were administered on schedule. Only in moments when the rhythm was interrupted did the subtle withdrawal manifest. Teachers, accustomed to observing children for visible behavior rather than internal state, noted restlessness or distraction, but attributed it to fatigue or temperament. The lesson remained hidden from view. Medical authorities began to acknowledge these observations tentatively. Discussions arose in private consultations, cautioning that repeated chemical intervention might be altering responses. Yet, even these reflections were constrained by the prevailing belief in progress. Immediate results were valued above long-term consequence. Withdrawal, subtle and intermittent, was not yet recognized as a phenomenon worthy of formal investigation. Thus the cycle continued. Each missed or delayed dose produced brief, unremarkable withdrawal. Each subsequent administration restored calm. The child's body learned, reinforced, and internalized the lesson. Relief would arrive only from outside. Obedience was rewarded. Resistance was quieted chemically. Dependence, unnamed and unrecognized, grew silently beneath the surface. In Victorian nurseries, this pattern repeated endlessly, imperceptibly shaping a generation. The syrup, sweet and measured, had taught a lesson deeper than symptom control, that comfort could not be self-generated, that calm required intervention, and that the body itself could be trained to rely upon it long before anyone had a word for what was occurring. The child slept again, finally, the syrup having worked its familiar magic, limbs relaxed beneath the blankets, chest rising and falling with the calm rhythm that adults had come to expect. And yet, beneath the relief, a subtle unease lingered not in the child, who had long learned obedience, but in the parents, whose eyes tracked every movement, every twitch, every sigh. In Victorian households, where responsibility and morality were inseparable, parents quickly learned to internalize any hint of difficulty as personal failure. A restless night, a subtle whimper, a momentary refusal of food, all were quietly scrutinized. The mother, eyes heavy with vigilance, questioned her own care. Had she been inattentive? Had she delayed too long? Perhaps the syrup had not been measured precisely, or the timing had faltered. Fathers, equally invested in propriety and household order, noted the child's agitation with furrowed brows, wondering whether discipline, oversight, or attention had been lacking. In this era, calm was the ultimate evidence of competence. Anything less implied deficiency. Heroin syrup, administered with faith and care, became a mirror in which parents examined themselves. Every dose that restored order reassured them. Every flicker of unrest prompted self-recrimination. The body of the child had learned expectation, but the mind of the parent had learned guilt. Responsibility for compliance, obedience, and peace fell entirely on those tasked with daily care. The medicine's power both alleviated and reinforced the burden. Relief arrived swiftly, but so did the implication that failure to achieve calm was their fault. Medical advice reinforced this perception. Physicians spoke in measured tones about dosage, timing, and observation, emphasizing the household's duty to maintain consistency. Journals described the benefits of regular administration in hushed, confident language. Deviations were framed as errors of oversight, not as consequences of the medicine itself. Parents internalized this professional authority as moral instruction. They were responsible for the child's behavior, and by extension for the efficacy of the remedy. The subtle nature of this guilt was profound. No adult spoke openly of self-recrimination. It existed in glances, in the tightening of the jaw, in hands that trembled slightly while measuring the next dose. It was reinforced by social norms, polite conversations, neighborly observations, and the tacit understanding that the household reflected the moral and social order. A child who was quiet was proof of good care. A child who exhibited discomfort, however minor, was proof of failure. Even small deviations reinforced the lesson. A delayed dose produced agitation, which prompted parental self-questioning. The solution, the next spoon, restored calm. confirming both the child's dependence and the adult's responsibility. Calm was rewarded, unrest punished, and the parents, by virtue of their care, became both arbiters and enforcers of the pattern. Each repetition deepened the lesson, binding household, child, and medicine in a subtle web of expectation and self-scrutiny. Over time, this dynamic became invisible, normalized, and unquestioned. Parents no longer considered the possibility that the child's reliance had been shaped chemically. Their attention remained on maintaining calm, sustaining order, and administering relief with precise care. Guilt, ever present, guided their actions silently, ensuring that compliance and intervention were continuous and uninterrupted. In this way, the power of heroin syrup extended beyond the nursery, shaping not only children's bodies, but the psyche of those charged with their care. Relief had a cost. Parents carried responsibility, real and imagined, for each moment of agitation. Calm was not simply restored. It was purchased with vigilance, anxiety, and the quiet lesson that failure, however small, was always theirs to bear. The shelves in the apothecary had once gleamed with orderly rows of dark bottles, each labeled in crisp, precise lettering. Heroin syrup stood among them, a symbol of refinement, progress, and the promise of calm. Its presence was unremarkable, its use widespread, its authority unquestioned. Parents purchased it with confidence, physicians prescribed it without hesitation, children consumed it without resistance. Yet even in this age of certainty, change was beginning, subtle and deliberate, a quiet shift in both perception and availability. Rumors of caution began to circulate among the medical community. Cases that had once been celebrated, the calm child, the obedient nursery, the orderly household, were now reconsidered with a measure of skepticism. Doctors observed subtle dependencies, recurring restlessness between doses, and long-term changes in appetite, sleep, and behavior. These effects, while not immediately catastrophic, were cumulative, and their significance was slowly recognized. Medicine, once intoxicated with progress, began to acknowledge the shadows cast by its own certainty. Pharmacies responded cautiously. Heroin syrup did not vanish overnight, but it began to be withdrawn discreetly, replaced by other remedies deemed less potent, less habit-forming, and more aligned with emerging concerns about long-term effects. Shelves were rearranged, labels were quietly removed, new compounds, touted as safer alternatives, were introduced with measured fanfare. The public noticed little. The bottles that had once seemed omnipresent faded gradually, leaving spaces that were not alarming, only conspicuous by their absence. Parents continued their routines, often unaware of the subtle withdrawal of the remedy. Some were informed of alternative treatments. Others discovered them incidentally when a familiar apothecary no longer stocked the dark, sweet syrup. Anxiety arose not from chemical dependence, few recognized it, but from the disruption of routine. Calm had become habitual, expected. The absence of the familiar bottle unsettled households precisely because it interrupted the rhythm of reassurance that had been taught over months or years. Physicians framed this removal with careful language, emphasizing prudence rather than alarm. Journals praised the introduction of alternatives, citing reduced risk and increased reliability. The narrative remained one of progress, but it was tempered now with caution. Heroin syrup, once the pinnacle of refinement, was quietly repositioned, effective in the short term, potentially problematic in extended use, and deserving of careful oversight. The lesson was delivered subtly, ensuring that neither parents nor children experienced abrupt disruption or scandal. The children themselves responded with instinctive compliance. Where the syrup had once produced calm and obedience, its absence elicited minor agitation, restlessness, or frustration. These responses were interpreted as temperament, sensitivity, or routine disruption. No adult yet recognized that the body had learned to expect chemical intervention. that the quiet dependence had been internalized. Relief, when it arrived in alternative forms, restored calm, but the pattern of anticipation and reliance persisted. In this way, the quiet removal from shelves became another lesson, another shaping force. The syrup's authority had been curtailed, yet its influence endured in the behaviors it had instilled. Calm, obedience, and reliance remained embedded in the child's body, the household's routine, and the expectations of care. Medicine had acted decisively, then retreated carefully, leaving behind the subtle imprint of its own intervention. The lesson was clear to those who observed closely. Progress required not only introduction but removal. Influence extended beyond immediate efficacy, and the body, once trained, remembered long after the instruments of instruction had disappeared. The shelves were emptier, the bottles fewer, but the quiet legacy of heroin syrup remained, etched invisibly into an entire generation. The archives of Victorian medicine were orderly, precise, and forgiving. Case notes chronicled children who slept, coughs that ceased, and restlessness that vanished with measured drops of heroin syrup. Each observation reinforced the narrative of efficacy. Each record affirmed the authority of the physician. Each journal article celebrated immediate calm. Yet beneath these tidy lines, an essential truth was quietly omitted: the subtle shaping of the body and mind, the dependency learned before language existed, and the long-term consequences that no one yet measured. Medical memory, it seemed, was selective by design. Doctors recorded what they could see, and what they could see was immediate. Relief arrived. Calm followed. Compliance was observed. These tangible outcomes were sufficient to validate practice. But intervals between doses, the quiet agitation of a child anticipating intervention, the gradual dulling of appetite, the flattened affect, all were deemed peripheral or anecdotal. They were inconsistencies in a larger narrative of success, not phenomena worthy of study. By excluding these subtle patterns, medicine preserved the illusion that all had been achieved, that the remedy had done its work, and that the child was, in every meaningful sense, healed. Parents, too, participated in this selective memory. Though unknowingly, they praised the syrup for restoring order, for quieting restlessness, for easing the burdens of care. Nights that had once been restless were remembered as brief and easily managed. Agitation was reframed as temporary, inconsequential, or idiosyncratic. The memory of discomfort was overwritten by the immediate experience of relief. Heroin's sweetness, both literal and symbolic, extended to the recollection of events. Calm erased the memory of chaos, leaving only the reassurance of intervention. Journals reinforced this erasure. Articles celebrated the predictable responses of children to heroin syrup, noting cases of rapid sleep induction, softened coughing, and obedient comportment. Long-term consequences were absent, either unrecorded or considered irrelevant. When subtle dependence emerged, it was described in euphemistic language: habit formation, sensitive constitution, requires careful observation. These phrases acknowledged a phenomenon without confronting its implications. The memory of chemical shaping was admitted in whispers, footnotes, or marginalia, never in the central narrative of success. The children themselves, silent and obedient, became living testimony to this selective recollection. They responded precisely as medicine and household expected: calm when administered, anxious when delayed, compliant when guided. Yet they carried within them the memory of every intervention, every spoonful, every lesson in dependence. Their bodies remembered patterns that the archives, the journals, and the adults did not record. Relief had been taught before autonomy, obedience before agency. Medical memory had overlooked the enduring impact of what it celebrated. This erasure extended beyond the nurseries and clinics. Histories of practice, professional training manuals, and public accounts of progress preserved a vision of triumph while omitting subtle lessons about shaping, conditioning, and early dependence. The record was linear, tidy, and morally reassuring, leaving no space for ambiguity or reflection. What was invisible in the moment, the physiological adaptation, the anticipatory behavior, the learned reliance, was excised from memory, creating a version of events that reinforced authority rather than truth. And so heroin syrup's legacy endured, both celebrated and unexamined. Calm, obedience, and predictable compliance were recorded as success. Subtle dependence, anticipatory restlessness, and chemically instilled expectation were erased. Medical memory preserved its narrative of triumph, forgetting what the child's body had already learned, and leaving an entire generation quietly shaped by interventions no longer fully remembered. Years passed as silently as the measured drops of syrup that had once governed the nursery. The children who had been soothed into obedience, calmed into compliance, and conditioned to anticipate relief now approached adolescence and, for some, early adulthood. Outward appearances suggested success. They were neat, polite, and functional. Limbs moved efficiently, routines were followed, and public comportment aligned with expectations of propriety. Yet beneath this veneer, the subtle legacies of early chemical intervention persisted, quietly shaping behavior, expectation, and the body's innate responses. Where once minor discomfort had signaled adaptation, now it evoked immediate psychological tension. Adults who had once relied on the syrup now faced bodies that had internalized its patterns. Restlessness became an unfamiliar and troubling sensation, demanding external resolution that was no longer available. Sleep, once readily induced by the syrup, now required effort and ritual. Appetite, flattened in childhood, remained subdued, often leaving the individual unaware of their own physiological needs until prompted by social expectation or habit. The body remembered long after the instrument of control had vanished. Emotional life had also been altered. Laughter, exuberance, curiosity, and spontaneous expression, once vibrant aspects of childhood, were dulled or regulated unconsciously. Individuals exhibited a measured, cautious affect that appeared composed, even mature, but lacked the full range of unmediated experience. They had learned, early and thoroughly, that calm was imposed externally, and the lesson had persisted. The skill of enduring discomfort without external intervention had never been cultivated. Resilience, subtle and internal, had been deferred indefinitely. Parents who had administered the syrup watched with relief and pride, believing themselves to have guided their children through minor ailments with care and prudence. They did not see the cost. An entire generation of bodies and minds trained to expect intervention before adaptation, comfort before effort. Those small, obedient children now carried subtle marks of dependence into adolescence, patterns of anticipation, subtle anxiety when routines were disrupted, and an almost instinctive reliance on external structures to manage minor disturbances. Teachers, neighbors, and physicians continued to interpret the effects through the lens of propriety and outward compliance. Calm, obedience, and predictability were praised. Subtle internal struggles were invisible or dismissed. The lessons learned by the body: anticipation of relief, suppression of spontaneous responses, reliance on external intervention, remained unrecorded in professional accounts. Journals continued to celebrate the apparent efficacy of the syrup, even as its long-term effects persisted quietly in the very children who had once benefited. This generation grew into a world that demanded engagement, adaptability, and internal resilience, yet their bodies had been conditioned differently. The mechanisms of dependence, learned so early and subtly, were difficult to recognize or correct. Tasks that required patience, tolerance for discomfort, or self-regulation were approached with habitual caution or external reliance. Emotional reactions were moderated by unconscious training, often leaving individuals uncertain of their own instincts. The lesson of early intervention, once celebrated as medical triumph, now persisted as a subtle burden. Calm, compliance, and measured behavior remained visible and socially praised, but the cost, the quiet shaping of bodies, expectations, and emotional life endured. Heroin syrup, long removed from shelves, continued to influence the generation it had molded. Children who had once slept obediently under its guidance had grown, but the echoes of its instruction lingered in every measured breath, every anticipated response, and every quiet expectation that relief, in whatever form, would always arrive from without. Progress, in Victorian medicine, was rarely heralded with ceremony or fanfare. It arrived quietly, in measured doses, in laboratories where glassware gleamed, in journals where outcomes were recorded with clinical precision. It was celebrated through calm children, obedient households, and the authority of physicians whose confidence seemed absolute. Yet beneath this facade of achievement lay a more somber truth. Every advance carried its own shadow, and heroin syrup, once praised as a refinement of opium, had its victims long before caution had a voice. The children, those silent pupils of chemistry and authority, had paid the most immediate price. Their bodies had been trained to obey, their minds conditioned to anticipate relief, and their resilience quietly curtailed. The lessons of dependency were absorbed before language existed to name them. Restlessness no longer signaled adaptation. Discomfort no longer prompted self-regulation. Relief, delivered with precision and repetition, became the arbiter of experience, reshaping physiology and temperament without acknowledgement. Their obedience was applauded, yet the cost lay beneath the visible calm. Parents, too, bore a subtle burden. They had acted out of love, following the guidance of trusted physicians and the recommendations printed in journals. Each measured dose, administered with care, reinforced their belief in propriety, competence, and morality. Yet they could not know the full consequences of their interventions. Guilt, latent and pervasive, often accompanied even minor agitation or delay, reinforcing a quiet anxiety that bound household and medicine together. The adults were participants in the same system that had shaped the child, enmeshed in routines that both relieved and imposed. Physicians, confident in the power of progress, rarely revisited their own assumptions. Journals celebrated immediate outcomes: coughs subdued, sleep restored, households orderly. Long-term consequences, subtle dependencies, and emotional flattening were absent from the record, rendered invisible by the very certainty that had elevated the remedy. Those who began to notice were cautious, recording observations in footnotes or marginalia, careful to preserve the narrative of success. Progress, it seemed, required the selective erasure of anything that might complicate its story. The society that consumed and celebrated these medical innovations also bore responsibility, albeit unknowingly. Calm, obedience, and visible health were prized above autonomy, resilience, or independent growth. The lessons taught chemically were aligned perfectly with social expectations. Quiet children reflected well on families, households, and communities. The syrup's influence extended beyond medicine, shaping cultural standards of propriety, behavior, and expectation. Its victims were praised, even rewarded, for qualities that had been instilled rather than innate. By the time awareness of the consequences slowly emerged, the patterns were entrenched. Children had grown, their bodies and minds bearing the invisible lessons of chemical intervention. Habits of reliance, anticipatory behavior, and subdued affect persisted. Physicians reflected on the subtle harms, parents on the quiet anxieties, society on the seemingly obedient generation. Yet none could fully undo the shaping that had already occurred. Progress, for all its promise, had exacted its toll. Heroin syrup, once lauded as a triumph of refinement, had done more than relieve symptoms. It had instructed bodies, reshaped behaviors, and established expectations that endured long after the immediate benefits had faded. Its victims were invisible, obedient, and quietly molded, their experience recorded selectively, remembered faintly, and understood fully only in hindsight. In this, Victorian medicine revealed its paradox. Every measure of progress required sacrifice, every demonstration of success concealed cost, and every calm child, obedient and serene, was a testament not only to medical authority but to the quiet, enduring imprint of those who had learned, before understanding, to rely. Progress, it seemed, had always demanded victims,